Christmas Miscellany 2020 by Various. Part 1, Christmas Eve Polchester Winter Piece in The Old Ladies, 1924, by Hugh Walpole. It was a seasonable Christmas that year. Enough snow fell, then enough frost came, and then the sun shone. If it did not shine, at least it rode a circle of crimson fire through the heavens, and, before the frost, but after the slime of preparatory fogs, fragments of its fire splashed the high street and spread in pools across the precinct's floor. As I have intimated in other chronicles, Polchester of the old days was an enclosed town. The Riviera was unknown to it, and the Garden of Allah a dream with Omar. Though London might call to the richer citizens on one occasion or another, at Christmas time everyone stayed at home, and, more wonderful yet to our modern disillusion, enjoyed family parties with Christmas trees, plum puddings, stockings, and the waits invited into the hall. It is not, however, that the weather was any more romantic than that it is today. There were just as many rainy and muggy and foggy and dirty and dismal skies, and Glebeshire, warmer than any other part of the British Isles, has never had an intimate acquaintance with crisp and shining snow. About once in 20 years there are snowfalls, frosts, and blue skies, and how happy then everyone is, and how eagerly everyone hands down the year to an envious posterity. This was such a year, and 10 days before Christmas the frost came and held, the powdered snow remained jewelled and resplendent, the sun looked down from a sky as delicately blue as an eggshell, and laughed to see the fun. And fun there was. Magnet's toy shop in the market cloisters had a Father Christmas, a true and veritable Father Christmas, to be seen with 2 crimson cheeks and long snow-white beard any afternoon between 2 and 4. Jeremy Cole so beheld him, and his sisters Mary and Helen, and the dean's son Ernest, and the Fisher girls, and little Tommy Chowner. He did not say much, but he moved between the dolls and the trains, the balls and the soldiers, as only Santa Claus could move, with an authority, a benignity, a ripe wisdom, that no impostor could have been clever enough to feign. Everyone did their best. In the market-place there was a Punch and Judy with a thick-set, jolly-faced man in charge, and he might have been that very same Garrick, friend of Meredith, whose history has been elsewhere narrated. I don't say he was, and I don't say he wasn't. Halfway up the High Street, Grummage's, the stationers, had a whole Christmas tree in their window. Here was a stumbling-block to the whole High Street traffic. It was quite impossible to get any child, any perambulator baby indeed, past that window. It was a tree frosted, colored, and shining, hung about with every glittering bauble, shaped to a perfect pinnacle of exquisite symmetry. But best of all was the window of Hunt and Griffith, the general store. For here, for the first time in Polchester history, was a whole front window given over to pageantry, to none other than the scene in the life of Cinderella, when, despondent beside the fire, she is amazed by the sudden apparition of her pink-hatted godmother. There is the fire, and there Cinderella, there the pots and pans, the brick floor, and the huge kitchen rafters, there the godmother, and there, beyond the snow-lined window-pane, the vision of the gold coach and the snow-white ponies. So great was the confusion outside the window that had this occurred in these traffic-haunted times, the show must have been forbidden, but in those lucky days nobody minded, nobody cared. Let the children have a good time. Christmas comes but once a year, and even Mrs. Sampson, although her neuralgia was at its height, could not but admit that the window made a happy display. The town rang during those days with laughter. Proctor Hill, outside the town, had just enough snow on it to allow of tobogganing, and Paul Fields, having been flooded, gave for a whole wonderful fortnight the most marvellous skating. The town rang with laughter and the ringing of bells. The cathedral let itself go and burst into perpetual peals of merriment, to the great annoyance of late sleepers, dyspeptics, and ruminating essayists. There was fun everywhere, apples and oranges in the marketplace, and carols up and down the streets after dark. It was the best Christmas that Polchester had known for many a day past, or would know for many a day to come. Mrs. Amherst was one who had always enjoyed a seasonable Christmas. To her, as to every old person, Christmas was filled with sad memories, but she had a wonderful gift of enjoying fun at the moment of its occurrence, and being aware that she was so enjoying it, and because the fun in her life had been neither frequent nor extravagant, very small occurrences amused and excited her. This was the happiest Christmas known to her for many a day. Struggle as she might not to think of the money coming to her, she could not keep it out of her consciousness. She told herself again and again, and when she was alone in her room she repeated the words aloud sometimes, that she must not place too strong a reliance on her cousin's promise. He may have altered his mind the next moment. It's silly to believe him. Nevertheless, the solemnity of his words, the caress of his hand as it rested on her head, these things were difficult to dismiss. And the happiness that came from the promise was also difficult to dismiss. She was naturally happy. Give her the least excuse, and she must be happy. Although she believed that God did not intend that human beings should be very happy, because they were in this world for the training of their souls, and souls were better trained by sorrow than by joy, nevertheless an imp of happiness would continue to jump in her heart and stir her little world with his discordant cries of joy. Joy at what? A kindly action, a splash of sun across the street, a barrel organ round the corner, a stained-glass window, an apple, and a piece of cheese. She could not keep down her spirits, as, being a penniless, lonely old widow of over 70, she should. And this Christmas she lost completely her self-control. She adored above everything else in the world the spending of money, perhaps for the very reason that she never had very much to spend. She had never been able to believe that statement often written in the papers that millionaires did not know what to do with their money. Did not know? Why, she could spend £1,000,000 quite easily at Gummidge's alone. But there, the newspapers were never to be trusted. She liked greatly to be given things, but still better was it herself to make presents. The excitement of giving someone something he or she wanted was intense. To watch the opening of the parcel, to see the stare of pleasure and surprise, to hear the exclamation, to feel the affection flowing out. Was there any luxury in life like it? And it was a luxury that of late she had been compelled to deny herself. Last Christmas she had given Agatha Payne 6 pocket handkerchiefs, Mrs. Bloxam a piece of ribbon, and her cousin a pocket-book. Worst sorrow of all, it was impossible to send Brand anything. No use to throw parcels out into the void. The best she could do was to write 2 letters, one a month in advance, and this she sent to the only address she had, something in California, and then one on Christmas Eve, such as she had always written to him at Christmas time. This she also sent out to California, but she wrote it because for a moment it brought him closer to her. She felt, with his photograph up there in front of her, as though she had him with her in the room. These were all but poor substitutes for reality, and, cheat ourselves as we may, our subconscious selves refuse to be deceived. Mrs. Amherst knew nothing about her subconscious self, but she did know that after last Christmas she had a miserable sense of inadequacy and frustrated purpose. She had made nobody happy. Even Mrs. Bloxam had disappeared into the intimacies of her family, to emerge 2 days later with a black eye and a bruised cheek. This year she would fling her cap over the mill. She had prospects. She did not face them finally, those prospects, did not take them, hold them in front of her, look them in the eyes, and say to them, as one always ought to do to prospects, "Now, are you sound and healthy? Have you got heart and lungs and legs and arms and a good stiff back?" No, she merely reported on them. She heard that they were good and healthy and promised very well indeed. Then she went ahead. The plan came to her in the middle of the night, or rather in one of those early morning hours when the first cock crows and the hidden despair raises its abominable head. Lying there in the early morning, she drove her despairs away and considered Miss Beringer. Poor Miss Beringer! What a frightened, nervous, trembling creature she was! She would like to do something for her. She would like well to give her a happy Christmas. And Agatha Payne, too. It was then that the idea came to her. At first she was frightened of it. It would demand energy and persistence. And had she money enough? Money in the future would not do. She examined her purse and found that she had sufficient did she use part of next quarter's rent. She trembled at that, but she was sure that kind Mr. Agnew, when he knew of the promise that her cousin had made to her, would not hesitate to advance her. She trembled. Her heart warned her. Her cheeks were flushed, and she had a guilty air. But she held to her purpose, and once she had begun, she did not look back. Once she had begun, she could not look back. She moved during those frosty, colored days about the town, the very spirit of adventure. She found that she must go quietly. The excitement tired her, and sometimes she would, in a moment, feel so weary that she could not get to the top of the High Street. And on one occasion, when she was at the top, she could not go down again, and had to take refuge in the shop of Mr. Bennet, the grand bookseller. There she sat, greatly alarmed, on a chair in the very middle of the shop, with busts of Byron and Walter Scott looking down on her, and a grand smell of Russian leather and old vellum in her nostrils, and the complete works of George Eliot at her elbow. Old Mr. Bennet was very kind to her, although she told him at once that she was not there to buy anything, and who should come in at that very moment but Archdeacon Brandon himself, magnificent, handsome, superb, ordering somebody on the Psalms, with the air of a king and a conqueror. She looked around her with the hope of seeing some of her husband's plays, and when she did not, would have liked to ask Mr. Bennet whether he kept them in stock, but her courage failed her, and she could only thank him very much and slip out of the shop as quietly as possible. Fortunately, she did not hear the Archdeacon's question, "And who was that shabby little woman?" He asked out of all kindness, feeling it his duty as the father of the flock to keep his eye upon all the inhabitants of the town. She tried to keep her head about her purchases. She found, as many another has found before and after her, that the best things were always the most expensive. And then, when it came to the central purchase of all, to the core, the heart, the kernel, the pinnacle, the pièce de résistance, the raison d'être, and any other foreign phrase that you prefer, she found that here expense was inevitable. Try as you would, it must cost more than you had supposed. Of course, she only wanted a small one, but even the small ones— And then, at the last, 2 days before Christmas, she found in the market-place, in a corner behind the old woman under the green umbrella, the very thing, a darling, a perfect specimen, a miracle. And when she inquired of the nice round-faced man whose possession it was, she found that it was only, well, less than the experience of the last 2 days had led her to believe possible, although more, a good deal more, than she had originally intended. She bought it, and ordered that it should be sent to her room, blushing a little in spite of herself as she named the address. She gave her name very carefully, begging him to be watchful that it should not be sent to any other room by mistake, and he promised her, saying that he would himself bring it. He did, in fact, arrive with it when she was there, and she liked him very much, holding him in conversation for quite a while, and then giving him an orange for the baby. After that she guarded her room like a dragoness, and would not allow May Beringer, who was already forming a too constant habit of dropping in, to cross her threshold. Christmas Eve arrived, and Mrs. Amherst, awaking to the inspiring voice of Mrs. Bloxam, was delighted when she discovered how fine and clear it was. No wind, the smoke rising from the chimneys elephant grey against the blue, the thin rind of frost, the sparrows already chattering at her window for their crumbs. After her little midday meal, she sat down to the table, found her paper and envelopes, and wrote to Brand. Her letter was as follows: My dearest darling boy, I must write to you as I always do, although I sadly fear that it will be a long time before you get this letter. The one that I wrote to you a month ago may reach you before Christmas, and I hope it will. This I am writing because it seems as though I am talking to you, and I don't wish to allow Christmas to pass by without having a word with my dear boy. Perhaps you have been writing to me, and still to the old address. I told them at Cheltenham to forward anything on, but they are so stupid at the post office, although, as a matter of fact, I always think it wonderful, considering the sort of postman one sees walking about, that they don't lose more letters than they do. Quite boys some of them are, and they none of them have very intelligent faces, although I dare say they are good men. Well, dearest boy, I try to imagine to myself the kind of Christmas you are having, but it is really difficult for me, because you told me in the last letter I had from you that it was quite hot at Christmas time. That seems to me very strange, and not very nice, I think. Of course, it is often warm here for Christmas. Both last year and the year before that we had rain and muggy weather, but this year it is delightful, with a hard frost and the sun shining, cold and seasonable. It's so pleasant for the children, and more healthy for everybody, I am sure. I am very well in health. That cough I had when I wrote to you last has quite gone away, and I am sure it's those lozenges that I found at Cubitt's. He's our best chemist here in the High Street. If only I could hear that you are quite well and will come home soon for a visit, I would be quite happy. You know, dear boy, I am an old woman now, and can't expect to live forever, so that I do hope you'll be able to come home soon. It's very nice here, and I'm very comfortable. There's something else I'd like to tell you about, but I suppose that I must not just yet, because it isn't quite settled. I think of you so much and pray for you night and morning. At this time of the year, when God came down to earth and took upon him our flesh and was a little baby in a manger, I think we should all make him feel how thankful we are. I know that he is looking after you, and so I don't worry about you. At least I know that you are warm. You used to be so careless about your underclothing when you were a little boy. My dearest boy, you are always in my thoughts. Your loving mother. She sat for a long time after she had written the letter, with his photograph in front of her. She thought of him in all the ways that she had known him, as a baby at her breast, as a small boy in his first trousers, as a boy going to his first day school, and forgetting her so quickly in the new excitement of other boys and games and masters, as all right and proper boys must do, of course. And then, as he grew, her interest in the strange new personality that developed, as flower from the bud, a personality that was so strange because it was like neither herself nor his father, somebody quite new. And then his growing independence, his chafing at the literary and artistic interests of his father, his desire for the open-air life and complete independence. Then her own strange sympathy with him, and although she loved him so dearly, she understood that he should want to get away and be free. She had felt it herself in her married life, and she realized that he was her own dear son, not by right of the quiet and domestic character that was most obvious in her, but by right of that secret independence and sharpness of judgment that her married life had subdued in her. He left her, and at intervals returned to her. She had been a woman of 40 when she had borne him, and he had been only 27 when she had last seen him, still a boy, although so strong and independent. She looked at the photograph until she seemed to draw him out of the frame, and he came to her and put his arms around her and teased her in the old laughing way that he had always had. But she was not simply a sentimental woman. She was, in fact, scornful of emotion that led to nothing, and so she put the photograph back upon the mantelpiece, put on her bonnet and her coat, and because it was already 3 o'clock and would soon be dusk, hurried off to take her present to her cousin. She summoned all her pluck, standing for a moment on the bridge and watching the river take on its evening color, softly purple under the dark shadow of the rising hills. Then, thinking of the evening that was coming and the fun that it would be, she smiled. Things always turned out better than you expected. The stars that were now breaking into the sky above her head were the eyes of God. She was watched over and cared for and protected. She had no need to fear. The town, as she passed up through the High Street, was bubbling with merriment and gaiety. The shops blazed with lights, the street was crowded, everyone was laughing and happy, hurrying along loaded with parcels, stopping to speak, it seemed, to anyone who was near that they might wish them good luck. This was the world that Mrs. Amherst loved. Why might it not always be like this? She stopped at the Cinderella window. How pretty and touching! She turned round to a stout man beside her and said, "Isn't it pretty?" "Indeed it is, Mum," he answered her, smiling. "My little girl wants to take it home, don't you, Pansy?" And the diminutive child squeaked out, "Yes." "What a pretty little girl!" said Mrs. Amherst. "Thank you, Mum," answered the fat man. "A Merry Christmas, I'm sure." "And the same to you," said Mrs. Amherst. The rest of the way home seemed easy. Arrived in her room, she set about the development of her plan. She had asked Agatha Payne and May Beringer to come and visit her at 8 o'clock. She had 2 hours for her preparations. The time flashed by, and in a moment it was 7:45. She hurriedly put on her silk dress, hung around her neck her thin gold chain with the locket that held Brand's portrait, brushed her lovely white hair, put on her lace cap, fresh and crisp from the laundry, then her stiff white cuffs. Finished. Completed. She sat down to survey her work. A smile played about her lips. It was the most beautiful thing that she had ever seen in her life. At 8:05 there was a knock on her door, and then another knock. Agatha Payne and May Beringer entered. They stood, bewildered, on the threshold. It was indeed a pretty sight. The curtains were drawn, and the far end of the room was duskily shadowed, but at the fireplace end stood the tree. And what a tree! Of just the right size for the room, it had a shape and symmetry that surely no other tree in all Christmasdom could equal. It tapered gradually with exquisite shape and form to a point that quivered and flickered like a green flame. On the flame sturdily triumphed Father Christmas, diminutive in body, but alive in his smile, his stolidity, his gallant color. It was the color that entranced the eye. Mrs. Amherst had worked with the soul of an artist. She had not overburdened the slender branches. The thin chains of frosted silver that hung from bough to bough seemed of themselves to dance in patterned rhythm. Balls of fire, emerald and ruby, amethyst and crystal, shone in the light of the candles, and at every place color blended with color. The tree was always the tree. The light that flashed from its boughs was not foreign to it, but seemed to be integrally part of its life and history. It had been placed on a long and broad looking-glass, into which it looked down as though into a lake of crystal water. The candles seemed to be the voices of the tree. It was vocal in its pleasure, its sense of fun at its own splendor, its grand surprise that after all it had come off so well. In proportion, in blending of color, in grandeur of spirit, it was the finest tree in England that night. On either side of the tree were 2 tables spread with white cloths. On one table were some parcels beautifully tied with colored ribbons, and on the other sandwiches, a plum cake with white icing, some saffron buns, and a dish of sweets and chocolates. The 2 ladies stood amazed. So pretty was the room with its soft pink colors, its light dim, save for the aureole of golden splendor shed by the tree, so utterly unexpected the display, that words would not come. Only at last May Beringer cried, "Oh, dear, dear me, dear me!" Both ladies had dressed in their party best. May in her orange silk, that suited her, I fear, not too well, and Agatha in her dark purple, a dress of a fashion now forgotten, too small for her, but that nevertheless, with her black hair finely brushed, her dark eyes flashing, gave her the air of older days, the air that had made Mr. Payne, 35 years ago, call her his gypsy queen. "Oh, I do hope you don't both think me too silly," said Mrs. Amherst, coming forward, "but I simply had to do something this Christmas. We've just done nothing the last 2 Christmases, and it did seem too bad. Don't you think so? I do hope you don't mind." "Mind?" said May Beringer, coming towards the tree and gazing at it with her mouth open like a schoolgirl. "Why, Mrs. Amherst, it's lovely. It's the loveliest thing. Why, I can't speak. I can't indeed. Words won't come. I can't say anything at all." Agatha Payne was moved more deeply still. The color possessed her, as color always possessed her, coming towards her like a living, breathing person, holding out its arms to her, whispering to her, "You and I, we are the only ones here who understand. I have been waiting for you, and you alone." Indeed, it seemed to her that the tree belonged to her and was hers absolutely. The 2 other women vanished from her consciousness. She could see only the pale golden flame of the candles, so steady, so pure, so dignified, the balls of amethyst and ruby and crystal, as they swung and turned and gleamed so slightly, and yet always with a secret life and purpose of their own. And the deep green of the tree, richly velvet under the light of the candles. She stood absorbed, entranced, waves of sensuous pleasure running through her body. So silent were they both that after a minute had passed, Mrs. Amherst was alarmed. "I'm so glad you like it," she said, almost timidly. "Shan't we sit down and look at it? I like to think of all the other trees there are tonight in everybody's homes, and the children dancing round them, and the presents." She broke off because a longing for Brand came to her so urgently that it was all she could do not to call out his name. For a moment it seemed to her foolish humbug, sham and ridiculous sentiment that the 3 of them, old, forgotten, not wanted by anybody, should indulge in this display. But looking up at the tree, she was comforted. Anything so beautiful had its own purpose. She had made a beautiful thing. She felt the joy of the Creator in her handiwork. They sat in a row looking at the tree. May Beringer was, all in a moment, voluble. She had so much to tell them, of the trees that she had known, the trees that she had had in her own house, the trees that she and Jane Betts had decorated together, the Christmas festivities that they had had in Exeter. You would think to hear her that Exeter was the centre of all the splendor and gaiety of the world. Oh, she talked and laughed, and was so wildly excited that she nearly cried. Agatha Payne said very little. She only stared and stared at the tree. The next part of the entertainment arrived. Mrs. Amorous picked up the parcels in their lovely white paper and colored ribbon, and, blushing a little, shell pink faintly coloring the ivory of her cheeks, said, "These are little tiny things that I got. You mustn't laugh at me, please, for getting them. I think the chief part of a present is that it should be wrapped up in paper, don't you? But I hope you'll like them." And they did like them. At least May Beringer liked hers. She had a case with 3 pairs of scissors and a book in a purple cover, The Light of Asia, by Sir Edwin Arnold. Agatha Payne said little about hers, only "Thank you, Lucy," in a deep, hoarse-throated murmur. She had a box of colored cottons and a purple blotter. She could not take her eyes away from the tree. Then they cut the cake and ate the sandwiches, and Mrs. Amorous made tea and listened happily, cosily, to May Beringer's reminiscences. How happy it was with the blazing tree, the dim room, the bells pealing beyond the window, the crackling fire. Each old lady forgot the other. They were lost in their own world of remembered and recaptured life, past joys, past sorrows, past desires, past regrets. The clock ticked on, the candles burnt with steady flame, the bells rang out. Gradually Lucy Amorous closed her eyes. She heard May Beringer's voice from a vast distance, then her own, faintly replying, "How curious! Indeed, indeed!" Her head sank upon her breast. May Beringer also, bathed in the warmth of the room, comforted with tea and happiness, closed her eyes. Her head nodded once and twice and thrice. She pulled herself up, stared sharply at Mrs. Amorous, saw 2 Mrs. Amorous, then 3. Her head fell. She also slept. Only Agatha Payne, her dark eyes fixed, sat without moving, staring at the tree. End of Part 1. Part 2, Christmas Day on the High Seas. In Under Sail, 1918, by Felix Riesenberg. Life was not always so pleasant on board the Fuller. Hard words were the common run of things, and the most frightful and artistic profanity often punctuated the working of the ship. Given a ship's company, barely strong enough to handle a 2,500-ton 3-skysail yarder, even had they all been seasoned, able seamen, our officers had to contend with a crew over half of which rated below that of the ordinary classification of seamanship, thick-skinned clodhoppers, all thumbs on a dark night, and for many weeks after leaving port, as useless as so much living ballast. The kicking and moulding into form of this conglomerate mass of deep-sea flotsam, gathered for the ship by the boarding-masters, and duly signed on the ship's articles as A.B., called for all but superhuman efforts. The curse is far more potent than the gentle plea, especially when hard fists and hobnailed sea-boots are backed by all of the age-old authority of the sea. To work a ship of the proportions of the Fuller, with 17 hands forward, called for man-driving, without thought of anything but the work required. The latter days of the sailing ship as a carrier, before invoking the aid of steam auxiliary apparatus in the hoisting and hauling, brought forth the brute sea officer aft, and the hardened forecastle crowd, half sailor and half drudge, for'ard. The bucko mate walked her decks, and the jack tar, stripped of his pigtail, his bell-mouthed canvas trousers, his varnished sailor hat, and his grog, remained in plain dungaree and cotton shirt to work the biggest sailing craft in the history of the world on the last hard stages of their storm-tossed voyages. Mixed with our real sailors were the worthless, so far as sea-lore went, scrapings of the waterfront, shipped by the boarding-masters for the benefit of their 3 months' advance, and furnished for sea with rotten kits of dunnage, as unreliable and unfitted for the work as the poor unfortunate dubs who were forced by an unkind fate to wear them. On the other hand, the real sailor-men of the crew were valued accordingly, and I can hardly remember an instance where either one of the mates singled out for abuse those men who had shipped as A.B. and were so in fact. My schoolship training, St. Mary's, '97, stood by me, and though barely turned 18, I was saved from most of the drudgery meted out to the farmers of the watch. After washing through the heavy seas, we encountered for the first few weeks of the voyage, while beating off the coast on the long reach eastward to the Azores, the long, hard pine sweep of the main deck became slippery with a deposit of white salt-water slime. The sheen of this scum in the moonlight, under a film of running water, gave the decks a ghastly Flying Dutchman-like appearance, and the footing became so precarious that something had to be done. "They have the bear out," Scouse announced, as he trudged into the forecastle carrying a kid of cracker hash, ditto of Burgo, a can of coffee, and a bag of hardtack, this cargo of sustenance being our regulation breakfast menu. "The bear?" I asked, as we gathered about this appetizing spread. "Yes, the bear," volunteered Brendan, grinning with the rest of the sailors. "The bear for Scouse and Joe and Martin and Fred." At 8 bells, as we mustered aft, a subdued banter went on among the men. The starboard watch were all grinning, and as they went below, 4 sheepish-looking fellows of the other side turned the bear over to the farmers of our watch. "Keep that jackass baby carriage moving now, d'ye hear? Keep it moving," bellowed the mate, for there was some reluctance in taking hold, and as Scouse and Martin tailed on, opposed to Joe and Fred, the doleful scrape of the bear mingled with the general laughter at the mate's sally. The bear consisted of a heavy box, a thick thrum mat lashed on the bottom of it, and the inside loaded with broken holystones and charged with wet sand. 4 stout rope lanyards were rigged to the corners and served to haul the thing back and forth, while the sand filtered down through the mat, providing the necessary scouring agent. A day or two with the bear in constant service, both day and night, cleaned up the decks and provided us with considerable amusement, that is, those of us who were lucky enough to be kept at more dignified jobs. Ships leaving the Atlantic coast in the winter months bend their best suit of sails. The severe weather usually encountered in working clear of the land, and the chance of having to ratch off from a lee shore, make this precaution one of great importance. The fact that green crews are bound to be more or less slow in taking in sail during squalls may also account for the storm suit under which we sailed from port. On our first night out, shortly before 1 bell in the mid-watch, our crowd having just gone below, the foretopmast stays blew from the bolt ropes with the report of a cannon. We had already clambered into our bunks, dog-tired, when this occurred, and muttered oaths anticipating a call of all hands came from untold depths of weariness within the forecastle. On deck there was the hurried tramping of feet and the shouting of the second mate. We could hear the long wail of the men at brace and downhaul, the "ai-o-ai-o," with all of its variation, as the slaves of the ropes launched their age-old complaint on the whipping winds. I lapsed into slumber with the dim consciousness that the second mate was handling the situation alone, and a heartfelt thanks for the warmth of the blankets in my narrow bed. A foot above me the cold rain pattered against the roof of the forecastle's house, its music mingling with the swish of the water under the fore channels. After 3 weeks of beating to the eastward, having fetched almost as far across as the Azores, and being in the region of the northern limit of the northeast trades, the captain hauled his wind and squared away for the run through the trade wind belt to the doldrums and the line. Fine weather became the order of the day, and life on board settled down to a more regular routine. On a Saturday morning, the day having broken remarkably fine, a brilliant red sunset followed by a cold gray dawn, assuring us of the settled weather that the steady glass made more certain, all the world seemed ready to rejoice, for it was Christmas Day. Word was passed into the forecastle by the other watch as we turned out for our breakfast. "We shift sail to-day." "All hands on deck for us, me boys," piped Australia, "and the first watch on deck tonight," chipped in Jimmy Marshall, "and a hell of a Christmas Day." Jimmy lit his pipe for a morning puff. Climbing into his bunk, he dangled his short legs over the frowsy head of Big Scoose, who sat with his dejected poll bent under the upper bunk board, a fair sample of the despondent crowd of farmers who faced a Christmas Day of labor. "A hell of a Christmas Day, boys, a hell of a Christmas Day, for we are bound for the Bloody Horn 10,000 miles away." Jimmy rendered this little ditty of cheerfulness as Fred picked up the breakfast kids and started for the galley, while we turned out on the sun-splashed planks as the last of 8 bells vibrated over the ship. She lay still in a clear calm like a scene by Turner, all of her canvas hanging in picturesque festoons from the jackstays, where the starboard watch had cast off the courses and topsails, leaving them depending in their gear. The decks had not been washed down, in order to keep them dry, and the mate himself had turned out at 4 bells to start the ball rolling. Long bundles of the fine weather canvas were stretched on the decks ready for swaying aloft. Working like demons in the forenoon, and with all hands on deck after dinner, which was dispatched in haste, we had the course, and in turn the topsails and lightsails lowered to the deck, and the gantlines rigged to hoist the summer canvas. This we sent aloft in record time. These old sails, soft and mellow, veterans of a dozen voyages, patched and repatched, with whole new cloths of a lighter grade here and there, streaking the dull white-weathered surface, were as smooth and pliable as a baby's bonnet. On some of them, the 4 upper topsail especially, we found records of the many crews who had handled them before. "James Brine, Liverpool, on his last voyage," was one inscription. I hope Brine achieved his end and stayed ashore. A date under this was hardly decipherable, but may have been January, June, or July, the day the 8th, and the year 1893. Bending a sail calls for the nicest knowledge. The passing of the head earing must be done in a certain manner, so the head of the sail will hold well up on the yardam. The gear, consisting of tack sheets, clew garnets, and bunt lines, in the case of a course, not to mention the leech lines and bow lines, must all be rove and rigged just so. The rubbins, or pieces of rope yarn, are all looped through the head holes, ready for bending the sail to the iron jackstay on the yard, and when a sailor does the job, all goes as smooth as a wedding when the parson knows his job. After the labors of a busy day, the ship presented the comfortable, well-patched appearance of a man in the woods, free from the stiffness of new white linen, and naturally fitting into the familiar folds of old duds, unconventional, but plenty good enough. The bright spars still attested to her smartness, but we were in easy trade-wind weather, and dressed accordingly. The foresail was particularly large, with extra cloths in the leeches made to catch and hold every breath of wind blowing over the deck. The sail locker was restowed with our best suit, and between the coils of canvas we liberally spread a bundle of old newspapers brought out by the mate. "To give the rats something to chew on," he remarked, as we ran the stiff new canvas in, tier upon tier. One thing that Frenchy called my attention to in the stowing of the locker was the fact that the storm canvas, lower topsails, and staysails were placed handy for immediate removal, the mate assuring himself of this fact by personal supervision. Indeed, he knew just where each particular sail was located in the locker, and could go in and lay his hand upon it in the darkest night, as he more than once demonstrated during the course of the voyage. That night a tired lot of men sat down to supper. The cold salt beef, the hard bread, and the can of tea came from the galley in their usual order. Fred, who was mess cook for that week, went back to the galley after depositing the regulation Saturday night grub. As he left the forecastle door, he turned back at us with a grin on his wide, good-natured face, bristling with uneven outcroppings of yellow stubble. Fred reminded me of an amiable plodder hulking out in his dungaree jacket while the watch fell to on the beef and tack. I guess he forgot to thank the cook for putting so many bugs in the tea, ventured Brendan. Maybe he's going to have to take Christmas dinner with the captain in the cabin. They have a real plum pudding there. I saw it in the galley, said Joe. Plum pudding. Christmas! The thoughts of loved ones far away, and of those distant homes that perhaps were remembering some of us out on the broad bosom of the deep waters, came as a pang. All of us, I believe, felt this. For a moment or two silence ensued. Then Fred burst through the forecastle door with a big surprise. "Pie, boys, pie!" he shouted, depositing 3 tin plates on the forecastle deck, for we dined with the deck as a table, sitting about the kids on low benches. The precious pie was cut with the greatest regard for equality by no less an expert hand than that of Frenchy, assisted by Australia, who showed us how to cut a pie into 3 parts by measuring across the diameter with a knife, adding a little to this, and then this length went 3 times into the circumference. Jimmy Marshall failed to agree with this theory, but was fairly beaten in the result, for Australia was right. The pie certainly was cut into 3 very equal parts. "An engineer in the mines showed me this," said Australia. "He says pi times across the pie is all the way around. Mathematics is what he calls this." Australia was nearly right at that, and the marks he made on the crust of the confections baked by Chow served as a reliable guide for Frenchy, also bolstering him immensely in the eyes of the more humble members of the port watch. That Australia chap certainly knew a thing or two, even if he was not the best sailor in the world. But Jimmy Marshall's comment was simply, "Rats!" After supper, when pipes were glowing, and most of us sought our bunks for the hour or so that remained to us in the last dog watch, a discussion arose as to what kind of pie it was. Frenchy, the great gastronomic authority, claimed it was English currant pie. "They taste so bitter, that's why I know," he added with an air of finality. Others differed with him. Scouse said it was red crabapple pie. Martin claimed it was nothing but plum pie. I thought it tasted like cranberry, but was not sure. At last, to settle the matter, and at the earnest request of the crabbed Jimmy, Fred trudged aft to the galley to consult Chow and wind up the argument. He returned in triumph with a large tin can done up in a gaudy red label marked "Pie Fruit." Shortly after entering the northeast trades, we encountered the region of tropic rains, of daily thunderstorms, and of abundant drinking and washing water. We rigged an old sail over the gallows frame in the main deck to catch the rain, which was teamed through a canvas pipe to the main tank, a large upright iron cylinder standing on the keelson blocks in the main hold, just abaft of the main mast. Our allowance of 3 quarts a day per man was anything but satisfying in the tropic atmosphere of the torrid zone. At least half of this whack of water went to the galley for use in the preparation of food, and the rest was divided between the scuttlebutt and the water barrel, from which it was drawn sparingly for washing purposes, usually a mere rinse to clean off the salt of sea-water scrub. In the extreme heat, during the frequent periods of calm, our suffering through the lack of water became intense. The Fuller, like many other ships sailing from New York, put to sea with her water tank barely a quarter full, relying on the tropic rains to replenish the supply. When the rains did finally come, we fairly reveled in the luxury of abundant fresh water, drinking, washing clothes, bathing, and just plain wasteful wallowing in the refreshing element. With the first douse of rain, all hands turned out on deck to fill their pannikins under the spouting drains from the forward house. The conduct of a deep-water sailing voyage in the old days of wooden ships called for what today would be considered the highest type of scientific management. In the maintenance of the vessel, each part of the complicated fabric received its due attention at some particular point in the voyage where the weather was favorable for that certain operation. So in the entry to the rainy belt, that uncertain region of the doldrums, where almost constant precipitation takes turn about with calm or light baffling winds, we were turned loose on the job of scrubbing paintwork. The work was started aft, and each watch did its own side of the ship, there being much rivalry as to who was doing the most work. Everybody took a hand in this, and Brendan and Marshall would curse unmercifully at the job when well out of earshot of the other guard. Our hands became wrinkled with the constant wet, the calloused flesh getting soft and cheesy, while our oilskins, in which we worked during the worst downpours, became soaked and clammy through constant use. We were not allowed the bucket of classic sooji of the steamship sailor, a mixture of caustic soda, soft soap, and water, but were provided with nothing but a small tin of brick dust and a rag of burlap. A rope-handled deck bucket and a small swab completed the outfit. Add to this formula an abundance of elbow grease and slithers of tropic rain, and you get paintwork polished smooth and white as ivory. A week or so, with all hands on the paintwork, whenever the working of the ship would permit, transformed her into a model of neatness. Woe to the luckless wretch who by any chance marred the deck or paintwork with a drop of grease or tar. About this time we made our acquaintance with the flying fish, these swift travellers often shooting over our deck at night, and being caught in the belly of one of the courses or the spanker. A flying fish for breakfast is not bad, and many were caught by the men on deck keeping a sharp lookout for them. The mates were also watching for the bag of flying fish, and whenever one landed on the poop or in the waist, one or the other of the mates would call out and have a hand bring the fish aft. One night a fish landed somewhere in the waist. We could hear the wet splatter of the flying fins, as it was calm and the deck quiet. Mr. Zirk, who was leaning against the weather swifter of the mizzen shrouds, roused himself and called out for someone to bring the fish aft. Several of the watch started to search for the visitor, for we also had heard him land, but without success. "How about that fish?" shouted the mate, after a decent interval, while the search was going on. "Can't find it, sir," Joe piped up. "The hell you can't," thundered the mate. "There he is," and again we heard a faint splash of the wings. "Get a light, you damn fools," was the order, for it was mighty dark. "Now come, quick, pronto," and as Scouse banged on the door of the deck-room occupied by Chips in order to get him to open the lamp-locker, we thought we heard the splash again. With the aid of a lantern and all of the watch, the entire deck was searched. Finally, Jimmy Marshall let out a whoop. Here he was! Some water on the deck near the coils of rope hanging from the main pin-rail looked as though Jimmy was close to the flying fish. "Here he was!" again shouted the excited Jimmy, grabbing the lantern from the hand of Scouse. "Here he what?" demanded the mate, coming down into the waist. The mate bent over the wet spot and exploded in a string of oaths. "No flying fish ever made that! Here, you!" and he grabbed Jimmy. "This is some of your damn monkey shines, you old dried-up bundle of sea-tripe. Blank your gray hairs, I'll flying fish you. Lay aloft to the main skysail yard and watch the stars. I'll call you down on deck whenever we need you." For several nights after that, Jimmy spent his time climbing up and down the main rigging, for no sooner would he get up than the mate would think of something to do that required his presence on deck. The flying fish episode furnished us with something to talk about in the forecastle, and while Jimmy always tried to leave the impression that the joke was on the mate and the rest of us, we felt that his over-zeal in discovering the puddle of water in which his clever hand had simulated the nervous flapping of the fins of a flying fish had turned the tables. My idea was that Jimmy, after seeing how well the thing was taking, could not resist the temptation to get the credit. We also harpooned our first bonita, a very active virile fish, shaped like a short double-ended spindle buoy, and striped lengthways. These fish are exceedingly lively, and jump about with terrific energy when brought on deck. Before taking this fish to the galley, Old Smith of the other watch, and Frenchy, and, of course, Jimmy Marshall, tested the meat with a silver coin to see if it was of the poison variety. "If the silver turns black, the fish is poison," exclaimed Frenchy. In this case the bonita was pronounced good to eat, and a great feast was on that night. However, I never cared much for fish anyway, and did not touch it. Chow had certainly made an ill-looking mess of it, garnished with broken tack and basted with pork fat. "You'll wisht you had a bit of this tucker afore we get to Honolulu," was the comment of Joe, who proceeded to help himself liberally. Part 3. Christmas in a Happy Ship, in Stories of the Ships, 1919, by Louis R. Freeman. There was a hint of Christmas in the long stacks of parcels mail on the station platform, and the motley array of packages in the hands of the waiting sailors, but for the rest there was nothing to differentiate the Fleetward-bound train from the same train as one might have seen it on any other day of the year. There is only a certain small, irreducible minimum of men which can be spared from a fighting ship, which at any time is liable to be sent into action, and the season sacred to the Prince of Peace is no exception. To the average landlubber nothing could appear nearer to the height of misfortune than the lot of the sailor who has to leave a nice, warm, comfortable hearthside in the south of England and return to his unceasing vigil in the storm-tossed northern seas at the one time of year set apart above all others for the family and the home, and I did my best to introduce a note of sympathy into my voice when I tried to condole with the ruddy-faced man-o'-warsman who had kindly volunteered to help me find my compartment. "Odd to be going back aboard on Christmas Day, you think, sir?" he asked with a grin. "P'r'aps it is jest a bit odd to leave the missus jest now, but there ain't no queers in Scarpa Flow, and I've got a jolly good lot of mates waiting for me in the old blank. 'Tis the happy ship, if there ever was one, and Christmas at sea ain't arf so bad as you might think, sir." That there were several hundred similar-minded philosophers travelling by that train became evident at a point where they met and mingled for a space with some of the lucky ones who were gathering there to go home on a leave which had providentially coincided with the holiday season. Scan as closely as I would the men in the long blue lines, there was nothing to distinguish the returning from to the going on, save the fact that the former were bulging with Christmas parcels. Nor was there about any of the officers I met in the course of my northward journey any suggestion of an air of martyrdom on account of the fact that it was their lot to spend Christmas afloat instead of ashore. One of them was going to join a destroyer flotilla leader, and was too busy congratulating himself on the fact that he was to be second to a commander who had the reputation of having a nose for trouble, and the faculty of always being among those present when anything of interest occurred in the North Sea, to have time to lament the fact that he was missing, this time by only a couple of days, his 8th consecutive Christmas with his family. Another had equally high hopes of the life of adventure which awaited him in the light cruiser he had been appointed to, and a third entertained me for an hour with yarns of wardroom pranks on a battleship to which he was returning after a special course in gunnery at a south coast port. It was the latter who used the identical expression in describing his ship as had been employed by the sailor I have quoted above. "She's a happy ship, is the old blank," he said, with an affectionate smile, "and it's glad I am to be getting back to her again." The only man I met on the whole journey who seemed in the least sorry for himself was a king's messenger. He was carrying a turkey under one arm and a dispatch-box under the other, who complained that his schedule would not take him back to London until Christmas afternoon. In the battleship to which I reported, about the only evidence of Yuletide observable on my arrival was the huge accumulation of homebound letters which the wardroom officers were engaged in censoring. The day before Christmas was distinctly routine, with just a suggestion of festivity beginning to become manifest towards evening. The loungers by the wardroom fire smoked, chatted, and read the paper for an hour after dinner was over, but showed no disposition to melt away to bed as in the usual order of things. About 10 o'clock, a violin, banjo, and a one-stringed fiddle with a brass horn attached made their appearance, and upon these never entirely harmonizing instruments their owners began inconsequentially to strum and scrape. As fragments of familiar airs became fairly recognizable, the loungers began to lay aside papers and cigars, and to join in the choruses in that half-furtive manner so characteristic of the Briton in his first forerunning essays at close harmony. Until he is assured of the vocal support of his neighbor, there is no sound in the world, from the roar of the lion to the roar of the cannon, which the average Englishman dreads so much as that of his own voice raised in song. Volume increased with confidence, and it was not many minutes before the choruses were booming at full blast. For a while it was the more popular numbers from the late London reviews which had the call, but these soon gave way to ragtime, and that in turn to those old familiar songs which have warmed the hearts and bound closer the ties of comradeship of the good fellows of the Anglo-Saxon world since ships first began to set sail from the shores of England to people the ends of the earth. From Clementine and Who Killed Cock Robin to Swanee River and My Old Kentucky Home, there was not a song that I had not heard, and even boomed raucously away in the choruses of myself, 100 times in all parts of America. Every one of them was in the old college song-book, not a one of them but which every man of the millions America is training for the great fight could have joined in without faking a word or a note. A slight shifting of the gilt braid on the blue sleeves, a reshuffling of the papers and magazines on the table, and the wardrooms of the blank might have passed for that of any American battleship. The interposing of four-poster and pennant-papered walls, the placing of the lounging figures in proper mufti, and you would have had a room in an American college frat house or club. The men, the songs, the vibrant spirit of good fellowship would have done for either of the settings. Poignantly suggestive of the things of bygone college days was the change which came over the spirit of the scene when an exuberant young sub-lieutenant began doing stunts by trying to climb around a service chair without touching the deck. His inevitable fall upset the tilted chair of a visiting snotty who was playing his mandolin, and an instant later the two were rolling in a close embrace. Suddenly someone shouted "Scrum!" and with an impetuous rush the singers ranged themselves into two rival rugger teams, each trying to push the other against the wall. Twitching at the stir of long dormant impulses, I restrained myself with an effort from mixing in the joyous melee, and maintained my dignity as a newly arrived visitor by backing into a corner and erecting a sofa barricade against the swirling human tide. "Shades of Stanford and old Encina Hall," I found myself gasping. "It's a rough house, a real college rough house." While it lasted, that scrum had all the fierce abandon of a freshman-sophomore cane rush. But even at its very climax, when it had upset the electric heater and was threatening to engulf the coal stove, there was a differentiation. One sensed rather than saw the thread of control restraining it, and knew that every pushing, laughing player of the game was subconsciously alert for a signal that would send him, tense and ready, to the performance of those complexly simple duties training for which he had given the best part of his life. Rugger gave place to chair polo, and that highly diverting sport in turn to comparatively formal bouts of wrestling and feats of strength and agility. It was while a row of shirt-sleeved figures were at the height of a bat competition, which consisted of seeing which one could hang the longest by his toes from a steel beam of the ceiling, that the fleet surgeon edged gingerly in behind my barrier, and remarked that it was funny to think how that up-ended line of young fighting-cocks might be tumbling from their roost to go to action stations at the next tick of the clock, and they fight just like they play, he went on, fingering a sprained wrist that was proffered for diagnosis. "We've not a single case of any kind in the hospital to-day, and the men are just as healthy in mind as they are in body. It's half the battle, let me tell you, to live in a happy ship." Christmas morning broke cold and clear, with a roistering wind from the north furrowing the floe with translucent ridges of white-capped jade and chrysoprase. All but the imperative routine duties of the ship were suspended, and the men spent many hours decorating the mess deck for their midday feast. When all was ready, the band, its various members masquerading as everything from Red Cross nurses and ballet girls to German naval prisoners and American cowboys, came to lead the captain and wardroom officers on their ceremonial Christmas visiting round. From mess to mess we marched, the capering band leading the way, and a policeman with a sausage club shepherding the stragglers at the rear. Every table was loaded not only with its Christmas dinner, but also with all the gifts received by those who sat there, as well as with any trinkets or souvenirs they had picked up in the course of their foreign cruises. Especially and intentionally conspicuous were numerous home photographs stuck up in or propped against the cakes and boxes of sweets. Most of the tables had Merry Christmas and various other seasonal mottos printed with letters ingeniously built from cigarettes. A running fire of greeting met us at every turn, and at each table cigarettes, sweets, or chunks of succulent plum pudding were pressed upon us. Acceptance for the most part was on the ancient touch and remit system. I noticed that the officers spoke to most of the men directly under them by name, and that the exchange of greetings was invariably of unfeigned cordiality on both sides. The tour completed, the band escorted us aft, where, with a hearty 3 cheers and a tiger for the captain and commander severally, and the wardroom officers jointly, it left us and rollicked back to serenade the feasters forward. Christmas chapel was a simple Church of England service without a sermon, followed by Holy Communion for those who desired to celebrate it. Luncheon, in order that the wardroom servants could be free for feasting with their mates, was on the buffet plan, each officer serving himself from a side table. 2 or 3 of the men with whom I had spoken in the course of the morning round had used that now familiar expression about the good fortune of being in a happy ship, but the climax was capped that evening at dinner, at which the wardroom entertained the warrant officers, when the captain employed it in explaining the easy bon camaraderie characterizing that interesting occasion. I had told him how many times I had heard the words in question since my arrival, and asked him point blank if I was to assume by implication that the other ships of the fleet were only dismal prisons of steel in comparison. "Perhaps the men would try to make you believe something to that effect," he laughed, "but so also would those of the blank and the blank and the blank, regarding each other, the rest of the squadron, and the whole of the Grand Fleet. As a matter of fact, if you had been on any one of them during the last 24 hours, you would probably have seen and heard and experienced just about what you have seen and heard and experienced here. You will not go far wrong if you say we are all happy ships up here. The happy ship is a tradition of the British Navy, and it's the one type of craft which does not become out of date with the march of science and the passage of the years." End of Part 3. Part 4. An Arctic Christmas in Deep Sea Hunters in the Frozen Seas, 1923, by Alpheus Hyatt Verrill. So rapidly had the time passed that the boys could scarcely believe that half the winter was over. As Tom, on the morning after their musk ox hunt, started to write down the events of the preceding day in his diary, he uttered a surprised ejaculation. "Gosh, Jim, it's only 2 weeks till Christmas." "No," exclaimed Jim. "Gee, I didn't realize it. We'll have to have a celebration. I wonder what they do up here." "Of course we celebrate," the captain assured them when they spoke to him about the holidays. "Reckon we'd better be getting ready pretty quick." So for the next 10 days every one aboard the Narwhal was busy. There was the same delightful mystery in the air as at home. Preparations for the Christmas festivities proceeded rapidly, and the boys were amazed to discover what resources the men and schooner possessed. Mike and the carpenter worked early and late at building a miniature whaling ship to serve in place of a Christmas tree. The grinning black cook labored from morning till night, or rather from breakfast until bedtime, baking cakes and pies, making mysterious dishes, and boiling great kettles of molasses for candy. And from dinner until nearly midnight the boys and men had glorious fun, pulling the molasses candy, roasting quarts and pecks of peanuts, and popping hundreds of ears of corn. Half shyly, the rough whalemen brought out clumsily wrapped packages and placed them on the pile of gifts on the chart table. Even the Eskimos seemed to catch the spirit of Christmas, and grinned and clucked and chuckled as they saw the preparations going on, for they had seen Christmas celebrations before, and knew what a fine time was in store. 2 days before the great day, the completed model of the ship was set up in the deck-house, and all hands busied themselves stringing the popcorn in its rigging, hanging the presents to the yards and masts, piling candy wrapped in bright-colored paper on the decks, and attaching colored candles along the bulwarks, up the shrouds, and along the yards. "Say," cried Jim, as the boys surveyed the completed substitute for a tree with approval, "every one'll have to hang up his stocking. Look at that heap of presents." At first the men demurred, trying to laugh off their embarrassment, but the boys insisted, the captain seconded them, Mr. Kemp added his pleas, and old Pem chuckled. "'Spect I'm an old fool," he exclaimed, "but I reckon we can all 'ford to be kids come Christmas. I'm a-goin' for to hang my stocking." Stumping to his cabin, the old whaleman returned carrying a huge rabbit-skin underboot. "Only stocking I got," he declared, as all burst out laughing. "Well, begorra, 'tis lucky for old Santa that yez have but one leg, then," cried Mike. "Faith, and would two of them there'd not be a present for the rist of us." Now that Captain Pym had started the fun, the men quickly caught the spirit. Shouts of merriment, roars of laughter, and good-natured chaffing floated over the frozen wastes from the schooner as the whalemen brought out socks, fur boots, and heavy woolen stockings, and hung them in a long row along one side of the deck-house, while the captain and the boys hurried back and forth, filling them with bundles and packages. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. Not a breath of wind stirred the frost-filled air. The thermometer registered 45 degrees below zero, and the boys noted that the sun rose above the frozen plain of the bay at 9:30. Jumping from their bunk, the two boys ran hither and thither, wishing a Merry Christmas to everyone. Presently the men came trooping in, and seated themselves at the long table loaded with the Christmas breakfast. The meal over, the Eskimos began to arrive, for all had been invited to spend the day aboard the schooner. Soon the deck-house was packed with the grinning men and laughing girls and women, all decked out in their richest furs and most elaborate costumes, every one carrying some bundle of fur or skin. Then peanuts and popcorn were passed around, which the Eskimos munched and enjoyed hugely. Presently the captain jumped upon a chair and announced that there would be a dance. Swanson appeared with a much-battered concertina, the carpenter brought out a wheezy fiddle, the ebony-skinned cook arrived with a banjo, and, to complete the orchestra, Nate produced a mouth-organ. Whatever the tune was, if tune it could be called, the boys never knew, but the men cared not a jot, and seemed perfectly satisfied. Presently the deck was covered with couples, each dancing a different step, all laughing and all as happy as a crowd of youngsters. Tom and Jim roared with merriment as old Cap'n Penn seized a stout Eskimo woman and started to waltz with her. Mike took the center of the deck and executed a weird hornpipe, which brought down a thunderous applause, and Mr. Kemp, with blackened face and with a strip of gaudy calico wrapped around his long legs and a gay bandana on his head, pranced up and down in a cake-walk. Then the Eskimos had their turn. The skin drums throbbed and boomed. A man with a curious tambourine-like instrument, like a thin drum filled with pebbles, added to the din, and the natives pranced around and around, chanting a weird song, stepping high, twisting and turning and moving in intricate figures. Then came games, followed by boxing matches, and the fun waxed fast and furious. Finally there was a tug-of-war, Eskimos against whalemen, and when, with wild shouts and yells, the Eskimos had pulled their rivals an inch over the chalk line and were declared the victors, Captain Edwards announced that the presents would be given out. As he ceased speaking there was a shout from the companionway, and everyone turned and gaped in astonishment, for there, pushing his way through the narrow entrance, was Santa Claus. Even the boys were surprised, for Santa had been kept a profound secret. Clad in a suit of brown wolfskin with ermine trimming, and with big sealskin boots on his feet, the fat little fellow beamed upon all through his voluminous white whiskers of bearskin, and entering the deck-house, tossed down his heavily loaded pack and brushed the snow from his sleeves and shoulders. At first no one recognized him, but at his first words a roar of merriment burst from everyone's lips. "Had a everlastin' tough time a-gettin' to you clean up here," he cried, striving ludicrously to disguise his voice. "But I reckon I brung presents for all." "By the saints, 'tis the first toime or ever see a one-legged Santa," chuckled Mike. "But sure 'tis a foine one he be, after makin' at that." Rapidly the presents were distributed. There were comfort bags for each member of the crew, every bag containing buttons, thread, wax, combs, salve, thimbles, pins, and a small mirror. Every Eskimo woman received a bundle of bright-colored cloth and a little package of beads. The girls were given bead necklaces and gold-plated rings. Each native boy got a shiny new jackknife, and every Eskimo man received a file and a plug of tobacco. Then the presents piled around the ship were distributed, and finally the men sheepishly, and flushing like children, received their well-filled stockings and giggled and snickered like schoolgirls as they unwrapped the packages. The Eskimo had done their part also. The men and boys were fairly loaded down with moccasins, fur boots, carved ivory curios, selected skins, and similar things, while the natives were mad with delight over the powder and lead, the matches, the hatchets and knives, and the brass and iron they received. Then came dinner, and such a dinner! There was a roast haunch of reindeer, bear chops, musk ox steaks, roast ptarmigan, and potted hare. Even the cranberry sauce was there, with mince and pumpkin pies, and, to cap the climax, a great steaming plum pudding, which the grinning cook brought triumphantly in, with its brandy sauce ablaze. And the Eskimos at their table also had a feast. The dainties so appreciated by the white men held no attractions for the natives, and so their feast consisted of canned fruits, thick tinned milk, and, to their minds best of all, vast quantities of lard and oleomargarine. Not until midnight did the celebration end. When the last Eskimo had departed, and 8 bells pealed through the night, all vowed that this Christmas in the Arctic was the jolliest one they had ever known. End of Part 4. Part 5. Conscience Money, in Jeremy and Hamlet, 1923, by Hugh Walpole. 1. These Christmas holidays had begun badly. Jeremy's mood was wrong from the very start. He had not wished it to be wrong. He had come determined to find everything right and beautiful. Now nothing was right, and nothing was beautiful. For one thing, there was nothing to do. It was not the custom, nearly 30 years ago, to invent games, occupations, and employments for your young, as it is today. Mrs. Cole, loving her children, had nevertheless enough to do to make the house go round, and Mr. Cole was busy in his study. The children would amuse themselves, who could doubt it? But at the same time there were so many things that they must not do, that, as the days passed, they were more and more restricted and confined. "Mary, what are you reading?" "Oh, I wouldn't read that quite yet, dear." "A little later, perhaps." Or, "Helen, you're sitting in the sun. Go and get your hat." Or, Not on the carpet, dear. It will make your clothes so dusty. Oh, why don't you sit down and read a little?" Before his departure schoolwards, Jeremy had been accustomed to these inhibitions, and had taken them for granted as inevitable. Then, in that other world, he had discovered a new row of inhibitions, as numerous and devastating as the first series, but quite different, covering in no kind of way the same ground. These new inhibitions were absolute, and the danger of disobeying them was far graver than in the earlier case. He fitted, then, his life into those, and grew like a little plant, upwards and outwards, as that sinister gardener, school tradition, demanded. Then came the return to home, and behold, those old, early, childish inhibitions were still in force. It was still, "Don't, Jeremy, you'll tear your trousers," or "No, not thou, dear, mother's busy," or "No, you can't go into the tower now, perhaps to-morrow," or "Once is enough, Jeremy, don't be greedy." And on the other side there was nothing to do. Nothing to do. He could no longer play with Mary or Helen. Mary was too emotional, and Helen too conceited. And who wanted to play with girls, anyway? Barbara was rather fascinating, but was surrounded by defences of nurses, mothers, and mysterious decrees. Hamlet was his only resource. Without him he would surely have fallen sick and died. But a dog is limited within doors. For Hamlet's own sake, Jeremy longed that they should be forever in the open. Oh, why did they not live in the country? Why in this stupid and stuffy town? But then again, was it stupid and stuffy? Jeremy longed to investigate it more intimately, but was prevented at every turn. It might be an enchanting town. Certainly there were sounds and lights and colors that, now that he was older and knew what life was, suggested themselves as entrancing. He simply was not allowed to discover for himself. Hindered, inhibited, everywhere. Had only Uncle Samuel been here, things would have been better. Uncle Samuel was queer and strange, and said most disconcerting things, but he did understand Jeremy. As it was, no one understood him. Today, had anyone seen a small, thick-set boy with a stocky figure and a snub nose, standing halfway down the stairs, lost and desolate, there would be 1,000 things to suggest. Then it was not the hour for the afternoon walk, or the hour was past. Children must not be in the way. Matters were not improved by a little conversation that he had with Aunt Amy. She found him one morning standing before the dining-room window, staring into Orange Street. "Well, Jeremy," she paused in the quick rattle-rattle walk that she always had in the morning when she was helping her sister over household duties, "nothing to do?" He neither answered nor turned around. "You should reply when spoken to." Then, more softly, because there was something desolate in his attitude that she could not but feel, "Well, dear, tell me." He turned round, and as he looked at her she was conscious, as she had often been before, almost with terror, of the strange creatures that little boys were, and how far from her understanding. "I want to go out and buy a football," he said. "A football?" she repeated, as though he had said a gorilla. "Yes," he said impatiently. "The little ones are only 10 and 6pence, and I've got that over from the pound Uncle Samuel gave me on my birthday, and father says I mustn't go out." "Well, that settles it, then," said Aunt Amy cheerfully. "I don't see why," said Jeremy slowly. "He's let me go out alone when I was ever so small before I went to school." "You can be sure he has his reasons," said Aunt Amy. She suddenly sat down on one of the dining-room chairs and said, "Come here, Jeremy." He came to her reluctantly. She put him in front of her and laid her hands on his shoulders and stared at him. He wriggled uncomfortably, wishing to escape from her projecting tooth and her eyes that were here gray and there green. Herself, meanwhile, felt a sudden warmth of sentiment. She wanted to be kind to him. Why, she knew not. "You're getting a big boy now, Jeremy." She paused. "Yes," said Jeremy. "And you don't want to be a sulky big boy, do you?" "I'm not sulky," said Jeremy. "No, dear, I'm sure you're not, but you're not being quite the bright, willing boy we'd like to see you. You know that we all love you, don't you?" "Yes," said Jeremy. "Well, then, you must repay our love and show us that you are happy and willing to do what your father and mother wish." Jeremy said nothing. "You do love your father and mother, don't you?" "Yes," said Jeremy. "Well, then," said Aunt Amy triumphantly, as though she had been working out a problem in Euclid, "you must show it. No more sulking, dear, but be the bright little boy we all know you can be." She left Jeremy puzzled and confused. Was it true that he was sulky? He did love his mother and father, but deeply distrusted scenes of sentiment. Nevertheless, Christmas was approaching, and he felt warm towards all the world, even Aunt Amy. Often and often he went up to his bedroom, closed the door behind him, looked under his bed to make quite sure that no one was in the room, then very cautiously opened the lid of his play-box and peered inside. At the bottom of the box were a number of odd-shaped parcels. He picked them up one after another and stroked their paper, then laid them carefully in their places. He sighed as of a man who has accomplished a great and serious task. Many times a day he did this. He had himself unpacked his play-box on his return from school. No one in the house, save only he, had beheld those strange parcels. 2. Christmas approached nearer and nearer. Now it was only 4 days before Christmas Eve. There was no snow, but frost and a cold, pale blue sky. The town was like a crystallized fruit, hard and glittering and sharply colored. The market was open during the whole Christmas week, and there was the old woman under her umbrella, and the fur-coated man with the wooden toys, and the fruit stalls with the holly and mistletoe, and the Punch and Judy under the town clock, where it had been for ever so many years, and the man with the colored balloons, and the little dogs on wheels that you wound up in the back with a key, and they jumped along the cobbles as natural as life. The children were deeply absorbed over their presents. Mary looked at Jeremy so often from behind her spectacles in a mysterious and ominous way that at last he said, "All right, Mary, you'll know me next time." "I was wondering," she said, with a convulsive choke in her throat, "whether you'd like my present." "I expect I will," he said, busy at the moment with the brushing of Hamlet. "Because," she went on, "there were two things, and I couldn't make up my mind which, and I asked Helen, and she said the first one, because you might have a cold any time, and it would be good in the snow. But we don't have snow here much, so I thought the other would be better, because you do like pictures, don't you, Jeremy? And sometimes the pictures are lovely. So I got that, and now I don't know whether you'll like it." Jeremy had no reply to make to this. "Oh, now you've guessed what it is." "No, I haven't," said Jeremy, quite truthfully. "Oh, I'm so glad!" Mary sighed with relief. "Have you got all your presents?" "Yes, all of them," said Jeremy, drawing himself up and gazing with dreamy pride over Hamlet's head. "Shall I like mine?" asked Mary, her eyes glistening. "Awfully," said Jeremy. "You'll like it," he said slowly. "Better than anything you've ever been given." "Better than the writing case Uncle Samuel gave me?" "Oh, much better." "Oh, Jeremy!" She suddenly flung her arms around his neck and kissed him. Hamlet barked and escaped the brush and comb, then seized Mary's hair ribbon, that had, as usual, fallen to the floor, and ran with it to a distant corner. Incidents followed that had nothing to do with presents. Then, when Christmas Day grew very near indeed, those parcels at the bottom of his play-box became an obsession. He went up 100 times a day to look at them, to take them out and stroke them, to feel their knobs and protruding angles, to replace them, first in this way and then in that. Sometimes he laid them all out upon the bed. Sometimes he spread them in a long line across the carpet. He brought up Hamlet and made him look at them. Hamlet sniffed each parcel, then wanted to tear the paper wrappings. Finally he lay on the carpet and rattled in his throat, wagging his tail and baring his teeth. Christmas Eve arrived, a beautiful, clear, frosty day. 3. Jeremy came in from his morning walk, his cheeks crimson, looking very nautical in his blue reefer coat. He went straight up to his room, locked the door, and opened the play-box. The parcels were all there. He counted them, felt them, sighed a sigh of satisfaction and pride, then closed the play-box again. He took off his coat and went downstairs. Helen, meeting him in the hall, cried, "Oh, Jeremy, Father wants to see you." "Where?" "In the study." Jeremy paused. The word study had always a strangely disagreeable sound. Their father never wished to see any of them there, unless for some very unpleasant purpose. He threw his mind back. What had he been doing? What sin had he within the last day or two committed? He could think of nothing. His parcels had kept him quiet. Both he and Hamlet had been very good. Only Aunt Amy had spoken to him about sulking, but that had been over a week ago. No, he had been very good. There could be nothing. Nevertheless, he walked down the hall with slow and hesitating step. Hamlet wanted to come with him. He had to stop him. Hamlet sat down near the door and watched him enter with anxious eyes. He did not like Mr. Cole. The study was a close, dark room, lined with bookshelves, rows and rows of theological works, all dusty and forlorn. In the middle of the left wall between the bookshelves hung a large photograph of the Forum, Rome, and on the similar space on the other wall a photograph of the Parthenon. Behind a large desk sat Mr. Cole, very thin, very black, very white. His small son stood on the other side of the desk and looked at him. "Well, my boy, what is it?" "Helen said you wanted me." He shifted from one foot to the other and looked anxiously at the Forum. "Did I? Let me see. What was it? Yes, of course. It's your journey money. I should have asked you many days ago. I thought your mother had taken it. She had apparently forgotten." Journey money? Of what was he talking? Journey money? "What journey money, father?" Even as he spoke, his voice faltered, because although he still did not know in the least of what his father was speaking, danger hovered suddenly near him like a large black bird, the wings obliterating the dusty light. Mr. Cole, who had much to do, grew a little impatient. Yes, the money that we sent to your master for your journey home. Your mother fancied, from what Mr. Thompson wrote to her, that she had not sent quite enough on earlier occasions, that the former sum had not been quite sufficient. This time we sent at least £1 more than the fare demanded." The bird came closer. Even now he did not understand, but his throat was dry and his heart was beating violently. "The money that Mr. Thompson gave me the day before the end of term?" Yes, my boy." "He gave me 15 shillings in the ticket." "Well, let me have it." "I spent it." There was a pause. Mr. Cole stared at his son. "What do you say?" "I spent it, father." "What?" "I spent it." Fright now was upon him, terror, panic. But behind the panic, like the resolution under torture not to betray one's friend, was the resolve never, never to say upon what the money had been spent. "What?" "I haven't got it, father. I thought it was for me." "You thought it was for you?" "Yes. Mr. Thompson didn't say anything about it, only that it was for the journey." "And did you spend it on the journey?" There was no answer. "Will you kindly tell me how, having already your ticket, you managed to spend £1 between your school and your home?" He felt the tears rising, and desperately beat them back. How he hated those tears that came always, it seemed, when one least wished to cry. It wasn't £1. One tear came, hesitated, and fell. It was 15 shillings. Very well, then. Will you kindly explain to me how you spent 15 shillings? No answer. Jeremy, how old are you? 10.5. 10.5. Very well. You have been a year and a half at school. You are quite old enough to understand. Do you know what you have done? Tears now were falling fast. You have stolen this money. No word. Do you know what they call someone who steals money? No answer. They call him a thief. Through convulsive sobs there came, I didn't steal it. Do not add lying to the rest. Mr. Cole got up. Come with me to your room. They walked into the hall. Hamlet was waiting and sprang forward. At once he saw in the sobbing figure of his master trouble and disaster. His head fell, his tail crept between his legs. He slowly followed the procession, only looking at Mr. Cole's black legs with longing. Upstairs they went, up through the tranquil and happy house. Barbara was being bathed, gurgling, and applause and the splash of water came from the bathroom. They were in Jeremy's room, the door closed, Hamlet on the other side. Jeremy stood, the tears drying on his face, his sobs coming in convulsive spasms. I am determined to know what you have done with this money. On what have you spent it? There was no answer. It is of no use to be obstinate, Jeremy. Tell me, on what have you spent this money? He looked about him. There must be something in the room that would show him. Not many things here. The little case with some books, the pictures of Napoleon on the Bellerophon, and the charge of the Light Brigade, the white bed and the wash-hand stand, the chest of drawers. Then his eye fell on the play-box. He went to it and opened it. Jeremy gave a long, convulsive sigh. Then, between his sobs, Father, please, I'll get the money. I will, really. I didn't know it was wrong. Those are mine. They break, 2 of them. I'll get the money. I will, really. Please, Father. A word here is needed in defense of Mr. Cole. A word is not, in truth, necessary. His action was inevitable. He truly loved his son, and because of that very love he was now shocked to the depth of his soul. His son was a thief. His son had lied and stolen. He was old enough to know what he was about. To himself, who had been brought up in a poverty that was martyrdom, and an honesty that was fanatical, no sin could be worse than this, save only the sins of the flesh. For more than 2 years now he had been troubled by Jeremy, seeing many signs in him of a nature very different from his own, signs of independence, rebellion, and, as it seemed to him, hardness of heart and selfishness. Now the boy was a thief, deliberately spending money that did not belong to him, in the hopes that his parents would forget. He bent over his play-box, saw the parcels so neatly laid out there, took one up in his hand. He looked back at his son. "What is this, Jeremy?" There was no answer. "Did you get these things with the money?" "Yes, Father." And then he said, "They're presents for Christmas." "Presents?" Mr. Cole took up first one parcel, then another, holding them up to the light. Then very slowly, with that deliberation with which he did everything, he undid the parcels. Jeremy said nothing, only stood there, his face white and dirty where the tears had left marks, his legs apart, his fists clenched. One after another they were laid bare and placed upon the bed. Rather pitiful they looked. A white-backed hair-brush, a coral necklace, a little brooch of silver gilt, a pair of woolen gloves, a baby's coral, a story-book, a dog collar, 2 handkerchiefs, a work-box, a cheap copy in a cheap frame of Dignity and Impudence, a tea-caddy. Obviously all the servants had been included in this. No one had been forgotten. Had not Mr. Cole been so wholly and so truly shocked by his son's wickedness, he must have been touched by the thought that had plainly gone to the buying of each gift. But imagination was not Mr. Cole's strongest part. Jeremy watched him. Suddenly he broke out, "Father, don't take them away. Let me give them tomorrow. You can punish me any way you like. You can beat me or take away my pocket money forever, or anything you like, but let me give them tomorrow. Please, Father. Please, Father." "That must be part of your punishment, my son," Mr. Cole said very sorrowfully, and finding it difficult to balance the things one upon another in his arms. In another second of time Jeremy was upon him, screaming, beating with his fists, scratching with his hands, crying, "You shan't take them! You shan't! They're mine! You're wicked! You're wicked! They're my things! You shan't take them!" He was mad, wild, frantic. His hands were round his father's thigh, his head beating against his father's chest, his legs kicking against his father's calves. He screamed like something not human. For a moment Mr. Cole was almost carried off his balance. The things that he was carrying, the hairbrush, the necklace, the picture, went tumbling on the floor. Then Jeremy was picked up and, still kicking and breathless, flung on to the bed. Then the door closed, and the boy was alone. 4. The first real agony of Jeremy's young life followed. 2 years before, just at this time, he had been in disgrace for telling a lie. His misery had been acute for an hour or two, and then, with the swift memory of 8 years old, it had been forgotten and covered up. This was another business. When, after lying stunned for a long time, thoughts came to him, his first emotion was one of blind, mad rage, an emotion quite new to him, never felt before. Injustice! Injustice! That was a new word written on the page of his life's book, never again to be eradicated. There came before him at once, as though it were being presented to him by some new friend who was with him in the room for the first time, the picture of the afternoon when he had bought the presents. The group of boys who had gone into the little neighboring town to buy things that they were taking home, his consciousness of the 15 shillings as absolutely his own, his first thought that he would buy sweets with some of it and keep the rest for the holidays, then the sudden flash of inspiration. Presents for everybody. Christmas presents for everybody. And with that the sudden flooding of his heart with love for home, for Polchester, for everyone, even Aunt Amy and the kitchen maid, and then his delighted discovery in the general shop where they were, that there were so many different things to buy, and so many so cheap. The half-hour that he had, and the wonderful excitement of taking back his parcels, himself packing them in his play-box, and it ends in this. He hadn't known that the money was not for him. He hadn't thought for a moment that it was not. He sat up on the bed and looked about the room, and saw the things scattered about the floor, the brush, the necklace. The glass of the picture was broken. At the sight of that he suddenly began to cry again, kneeling on the bed, rubbing his knuckles into his eyes. He felt sick. His head was aching, his eyes were red-hot, and he felt anger, furious, rebellious anger. He hated his father, hated him so that it made him sick to think of him. What would his father do to him? He didn't care. He would like to be terribly punished, beaten to within an inch of his life, because then he could with more justice than ever devote his life to hating his father. He would hate him forever and ever. And all this time he was crying in a snivelling sort of way, like a little animal whose limb is broken. The house was utterly silent about him. No sound at all. Then he caught a thin, feeble scratching at the door. He climbed off the bed and went to it. Opening it cautiously, he peered out. Hamlet was there, wagging his tail. He pulled him into the room, shut the door, dragging him onto the bed, folded him into himself, suffering himself to be licked from one ear to the other. 5. How terrible the time that followed! None of the Cole children could remember anything at all like it. Even Helen, who was nearly grown up now, because she was at the Polchester High School and had won last term a prize for calisthenics, was impressed with the tragedy of it all. How awful that Christmas Day, never by any of them to be forgotten for the rest of their lives. Jeremy came downstairs, and there was a pretense of gaiety. Presents were distributed on Christmas evening. Turkey and plum pudding were eaten. A heavy cloud enveloped everyone. The fanatic that then was in Mr. Cole began now to flower. For the first time his son appeared to him as a conscience-developing individual. For the first time he really loved him, and for the first time he felt that there was a soul to be saved, and that he must save it. For the first time also in their married lives a serious difference of opinion divided the father and mother. Mrs. Cole yearned over her boy, who was now in some strange way escaping her. She was no psychologist, and indeed 30 years ago parents never conceived of analyzing their children. She was only discovering, what every mother discovers, that a year's absence had taken her boy away from her, had given him interest that she could not share, taught him ambitions, confided to him secrets, delivered him over to hero-worshippings that would never be hers. Not for 10 years would he return to her. To be a mother, you must have infinite patience. Secretly, she rebelled against her husband's policy. Outwardly, she submitted to it. During all the week following Christmas, the Coles were a miserable family, and in the middle of them Jeremy moved, a figure of stone. They wished him to be an outcast. Very well, then, he would be an outcast. They thought him a criminal and not fit for their society. Very well, then, he would be apart and of himself. The presents were there, at the bottom of his play-box. His only definite punishment was that he should receive no pocket money throughout the holidays. But he was a pariah, and a pariah he would be. Once his mother talked to him, drawing him to her, putting her arms around him. "Jeremy, dear, just go to father and say you're sorry, and then it will all be over." "I'm not sorry." "Well, if you're not sorry about spending the money because you didn't know that you oughtn't to, say you're sorry because you kicked father." "I'm not sorry I kicked father." "But father loves you. He was only doing what he thought was right." "Father doesn't love me, or he would have known I didn't steal the money." "But, Jeremy, dear, father wants you to realize that you mustn't spend other people's money as though it were your own. You're too young to understand now." "I'm not too young to understand." Mrs. Cole sighed. This Jeremy was utterly strange to her. So old, so oddly different from the boy of a year ago, so hard and so hostile. She was very unhappy, and Jeremy, too, was unhappy, desperately unhappy. It was no fun being a rebel. Sometimes he was on the very edge of surrender, longing to go and submit to his father, fling his arms around his mother, listen to Mary's silly stories, play and shout and sing and laugh, as he used to do. Something kept him back. It was as though he were in a nightmare, one of those nightmares when you can't speak, a weight is on your chest, you move against your will. He was so unhappy that he told Hamlet that he was going to run away to sea. He had serious thoughts of this. Then suddenly Uncle Samuel returned from Paris. 6. It was a wet, windy evening. The rain was blowing in streaky gusts up Orange Street, sending the lamps inebriated, and whipping at windows as though it would never find outlet sufficient for its ill temper. Out of the storm came Uncle Samuel in a black cape and a floppy black hat, straight from that mysterious, unseen, unfathomed country, Paris. As usual, he was casual and careless enough in his greetings, kissed his sister quickly, nodded to his brother-in-law, grinned at the children, and was in a moment transported to that strange region at the back of the house where was his studio, that magical place into which none of the children had even entered. He did not that evening, apparently, notice Jeremy's desolate figure. On the following afternoon, Jeremy, Hamlet at his heels, was hanging disconsolately about the passage when his uncle suddenly appeared. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said Jeremy. Uncle Samuel was in his blue painting smock. Whereas the other members of the family were so well known to Jeremy that they were almost like the wallpaper or the piano, Uncle Samuel's appearance was always new and exciting. With his chubby face, the gray hair that stood up rather thinly about his crimson pate, his fat, stumpy body, ironical blue eyes, and little, rather childish mouth, he always seemed nearer to Jeremy than the others. Younger, more excitable, more easily surprised. He had the look of an old baby, Jeremy sometimes thought. He looked at Jeremy consideringly. "Got something to do?" "No." "Come into the studio." "Oh, may I?" "Well, I wouldn't ask you if I didn't want you. Yes, you may bring the dog." Jeremy's excitement was intense. Once, long ago, his uncle had said that he might go into the studio, but he had never dared to venture. He walked carefully like Agag. The door was opened, a curtain pulled aside. A long, empty room, with wide, high windows overlooking meadow and hill, a low bookcase running the length of the room, a large sofa with cushions, 2 rugs, some pictures with their faces to the wall, some other pictures hanging, funny ones, a girl with a green face, a house all crooked, a cow, or was it a horse? Uncle Samuel went to the sofa and sat down. He called Jeremy over to him and pulled him in between his knees. "Been having a row?" he said. "Yes," said Jeremy. "Kicked your father?" "Yes." "What was it all about?" Jeremy told him. Uncle Samuel listened attentively, his eyes no longer ironical. He put his hand on Jeremy's shoulder, and the boy, feeling the unexpected kindness, burst into tears. The misery of the last week overflowed from his heart. "I didn't know. I didn't really. I wanted to give them the things. I wasn't wicked." The man bent down and picked the boy up and held him tight. And then he talked to him. "Look here. You've not got to mind this. You were wrong, too, you know. Your father was right from his way of seeing things. His way isn't yours, that's all. When you get older, you'll find people often don't see things the way you do, won't like the work you're proudest of, simply won't understand it. There are as many different opinions as can be in this old world, and you've simply got to face it. You've just got to be ready for anything, not to get angry and kick. Don't let yourself be too sensitive. You'll go up and you'll go down, and when you're up, people will say you ought to be down, and when you're down, there'll be a few kind souls will help you up again. Misunderstood? Why, bless my soul, you'll be misunderstood 1,000,000 times before you're done. If you've got work you like, a friend you can trust, and a strong stomach, you'll have enough to be thankful for. You won't understand all I'm saying yet, but you soon will. You come along in here and be kind to your old uncle, who's never had anything right all his life, largely through his own fault, mind you. There, bless me, you're as soppy as a shower of rain. Fond of your uncle?" Jeremy hugged him. "That's right. Well, mind you keep it up. I can do with some. Will you say you're sorry to your father?" Jeremy nodded his head. "That's right. Now listen. This studio is for you to be in when you like. Not your beastly sisters, mind you, but you and your dog, if he'll behave himself." Hamlet promised. Jeremy ceased to cry. He looked about him. When they had come in, the room had been in dusk. Now it was too dark to see. He felt for his uncle's hand and held it. Nothing so wonderful as this had yet happened in his life. He did not know, however, how wonderful in reality that evening would afterwards seem to him. All his after-life he would look back to it, the dark room, the dog quiet at their feet, the cool strength of his uncle's hand, the strange, heating excitement, the happiness and security after the week of wild loneliness and dismay. It was in that half-hour that his real life began. It was then that, like Alice in her looking-glass, he stepped over the brook and entered into his inheritance. End of Part 5. The Christmas Trees, in Six Giants and a Griffin and Other Stories, 1903, by Birdsall Otis Edey. Of course they were bright. Otherwise they could hardly have been for a Christmas tree. They were 12 in a box, and they ran in twos as to color. By this I mean that there were 2 blues, 2 reds, 2 greens, 2 silvery, 2 goldy, and 2 bright pink. The box was divided into little compartments, 1 for each ball, and lined with a peculiar dirty cotton common to Christmas ornament boxes, and the compartments were meant to keep the balls from knocking against each other and breaking. This it did, but it did not keep them from constantly squabbling, fighting, and fussing, which, I am sorry to say, they did all the time. They stood, or rather their box stood, on a big table, with many other ornaments in Wanamaker's big store, and the never-ceasing crowd pushed backwards and forwards by them all the day. They were much admired by all, but no one bought them. It seemed that, being rather a high order of ornament, they were quite expensive, so they leaned against the edge of the shelf and shone, glistened, fought, and quarrelled as to which was the prettier, until the others were tired of hearing them. A large Santa Claus, resplendent in a red overcoat, stood on the top shelf in the center, trying to keep order, and around him a row of smaller and less magnificent Santa Clauses, with black coats, trying to help, but he was not so expensive as the balls, so they paid no heed to him. "Of course," said the Goldy balls, they always spoke together, "you may say what you like, but none of you shine as we do." "We think we give a purer and less lurid light," remarked the Silver. "You may do that, but you don't light up as we do," said the Red balls. And we," shouted the others. A nice fat baby just came by on his mother's arm and tried to take me out of the box, said the top Pink ball, trembling with pleasure. I hoped his mother would buy me. "We are not for sale singly," said the other Pink, a little hurt that the baby had not seen him. "Besides, he would have squeezed you and broken you. Then you might have cut his fingers." "Oh, I shouldn't like to do that," said the first Pink ball again, looking anxious. "I hope he won't come again. He might snatch me." "Don't you worry. If he snatches at all, it will be at us," said the Gold balls again. "Or at us," shouted all the others. "Ding dong, peace, peace," rang a bell, which hung on a trimmed tree at the corner of the table. "How you quarrel! Santa Claus, can't you stop them?" "No," said the old man sadly, "they don't heed me, they are so noisy." "Is this the one you mean?" A voice broke through the babel, and a hand took down the box. With one accord the gaily colored balls shivered, and each one closed his or her eyes, afraid to even breathe. "Yes, thank you. See, Estelle, what pretty ones, and quite unusual," said another voice. "Yes, ma'am," said the shop girl. "We have only one of these. They are a little higher priced than what we usually carry." The balls swelled with pride at this, and then, being unable to restrain their curiosity any longer, they opened their eyes and looked right up into the pale, pretty face of a little girl, who was gazing at them, but with a very small show of interest. Goldie decided she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She wore a black velvet coat with a wide fur collar and a big hat with plumes. Her fair hair was beautifully curled, and she looked very dainty in the rough crowd. Pinky sighed as he looked at her. "I would rather be with my baby," she whispered. "That little girl looks discontented and unhappy." They were already on the way to be wrapped up before they quite took in what had happened. Even then they were so excited they forgot to quarrel. "I expect we shall be on a very smart tree," said the Green, "and they will take care of us that we shall last years. I had a friend once who was on the family Christmas tree for 5 years, and he was not so nice as we are." "Oh, they'll take care of us all right," said Silver. "Didn't you hear the lady say we were the prettiest she had ever seen? And so unusual." And then they all bridled in their snug little compartments. The night was spent they knew not just where, but in the vicinity of a Christmas tree in Green's, for they could hear them whispering, and an occasional whiff of piney smell came under the lid of the box. The morning passed quietly, too. Their string was untied, and the box looked into by the same lady who had bought them. Then they were left on the floor with a lot of other boxes, and much general conversation took place. The balls felt rather strange, and kept very still. Suddenly there was a great commotion. The room became full of people, all talking at once, and there was hammering and rustling as the tree was set in place and the greens tacked on the walls. Then the lid was taken off the box, and the balls saw that they were in a large room full of people. In the center a great tree stretched its branches, waiting to be trimmed. Innumerable bundles tied with bright ribbons were piled around, and the walls were hung with greens and wreaths. Near the tree was their lady, and it was the little girl who had opened the box. She looked more happy and interested now, and was even more gorgeous than ever, with a velvet frock and lace collar, a big bow on her yellow curls. "This," said the gold balls, "is richness and luxury. Thank goodness we were high-priced and came here to live." The others all agreed, but the pink ball, she had a little pang of regret when she thought of the fat baby with the bright, earnest little face, and the well-worn worsted hood tied under its fat, chapped chin. Meanwhile, the trimming of the tree progressed rapidly. A great many beautiful and costly things were hung on it. Among others, our friends, who were prouder than ever, and shone to the best of their ability. Goldie made the acquaintance of a beautiful paper doll with feather wings and gold paper skirts, who floated on the branch next to him by the aid of an elastic glued to her shoulder. She was very aristocratic and hard to know, but he glistened his best and swung to and fro with her, and was happy. The green balls hung near the top, and were next to a large scarlet ball that came straight from Germany, and only spoke that language, but the greens were very good-natured, and, as they spoke a little German, they got along famously. When everything was ready, the people went to get dressed, and left the tree alone in all its grandeur, a big Santa Claus taking charge of the heap of toys piled at its base. Once alone, the ornaments began to talk. Amicably at first, but later, I regret to say, the quarreling commenced. Goldie began it. He stated in no very agreeable tone that he was glad they were in a house befitting their station. "Your station, indeed," said the big spike at the top. "Why, you came from Wanamaker's." Absolute silence followed this remark, and the little balls turned cold with fright and shame. Was it, then, a disgrace to come from Wanamaker's? The red ball looked pale, and the green balls grew greener still. "Wanamaker's is a large department store, is it not, where all sorts of things are sold?" asked a silver horse, who pranced on one of the upper branches. "Yes," said its companion, a gold cow, who seemed out of place, hanging as it did, head down, from a lower branch. "They sell everything from a wardrobe to a rolling-pin." "They have a lovely toy department," spoke up a new voice, and, looking towards the corner whence it came, they beheld a rather the worse for wear doll. "I have been there often with Estelle, and some of their things are very high-priced." "That," thought the Balls, "is a lovely doll, and we will do something for her if we can." "High-priced," said the horse. "Were you high-priced?" turning a little to the red ball, who hung near him. "We were," answered all the Balls in chorus. "That is why we had not been sold before." "Toys," said a beautiful soft voice. "Toys, be quiet. Do you know what we are celebrating?" "Christmas," answered several softly. "Do any of you know what Christmas means?" A long silence followed, and all eyes turned upward to where the Christmas angel hung from the ceiling by a broad ribbon tied around its waist. Its arms were outspread over the tree, and its dimpled hand seemed to be showering blessings on all. As no one answered, the angel went on gravely, "We are celebrating the birth of Christ. I am the image of the angel who brought the news, and I come each year to each tree to remind all people that unto you a child is born. And you all pain me by quarreling over prices at such a time." A sort of shamed silence settled on all the toys. The gold ball glanced at his lady love, but she was looking gravely down into the green below. Then Santa Claus gave himself a little shake. "You have made us all feel solemn when we want to be gay," he said. "Can't some one start a song?" "I will," said the angel, and he straightway began chanting, "'Twas the night before Christmas," and they all joined in. And when it was finished, all solemnity had disappeared, and wild gaiety and good temper prevailed. The evening was a great success. There were a great many people, and much light and laughter. The tree was praised, and our friends came in for their share of the admiration. When the guests had gone, Mrs. Miller called the maids to her. "Undress the tree in the morning," she said. "Save the larger balls, the dolls, and the tinsel animals, and throw all the smaller things away. Good night. Come, Estelle." Consternation fell on the ornaments. The larger ones gave sighs of relief, and the smaller ones shudders of horror. The little Balls glanced at one another and laughed nervously. "She cannot mean us," they said. "We are so beautiful and expensive." And Pinky thought again of the baby. "He would never have thrown us away," she murmured to herself. The night passed in speculation and very little sleep, and when the first rays of light peeped in through the shades, one of the balls, a blue one, was discovered on the ground in pieces. He had thrown himself down rather than be thrown away. The maids came early, and the work of undoing the tree began. Slowly the larger articles, including the tinsel animals, were removed and put away, until nothing remained but a few cheaper paper ornaments and the sad 11 balls, with their pride gone and their souls humbled to the dust. They were to be thrown out. They, the pride of the Christmas tree table, and all their boasts were for nothing. The rich had bought them, and now the rich were throwing them away. The thought of the ash can made them shiver, and the gold ones hoped they would break in the act. "I thought Christmas Day was different from other days," remarked a small, ragged boy to a larger but equally ragged little girl, as they slipped and slid on the icy pavement on Christmas morning, in search of any odd bits that might be left in the ash cans that plentifully sprinkled the edge of the curb at this early hour. "It is different, some way," answered the small girl vaguely. "There's presents for some folks, and trees. I think it's trees for others." "Trees? What for? I don't think a tree is much of a present," sniffed the little boy contemptuously. "I'd rather have a drum." "I don't mean a plain tree, Jimmy Tyler. I mean a tree all hung with things made out of shining stuff and candles and gold glass balls. Jimmy was struck dumb. Gold glass! Oh, my! I ain't never seen gold glass, he gasped. No, neither have I, answered the sister, but Billy's mamma says so. That seemed to be convincing, and they both poked away at the contents of 2 large ash cans, until a scream from Jimmy caused Sadie to jump almost out of her worn little shoes. "Look," he said, "is this one of them things?" In his hand he was holding the one remaining blue ball. He had a hole in one side, but he still had courage, and tried bravely to shine, even though the dust had enveloped him. Sadie stood spellbound. "It is one of them," she said. "Oh, who could have thrown it away?" "Sadie!" screamed Jimmy. "Could we take it home and put it on a tree for Billy? We could borrow a candle." "I'm afraid it would look bad all alone, Jimmy," she said sadly, "but," seeing the intense disappointment she had caused, "we can do it. First, let's hunt through the ashes some more. If they throw one away, there may be others." The diligent search was rewarded beyond their wildest hope, for not only did the entire 11 appear, all very dusty and broken in spirit, and thankful to be able to breathe once more, but also the remain of Goldie's lady-love, one wing gone, and her golden skirts in ribbons, but still beautiful in the children's eyes. While they were contemplating their treasures with joy beyond words, a man came out of the area-way, dragging a tremendous Christmas tree after him, which he threw into the gutter, and then proceeded to chop up. Sadie watched him silently for a minute, and then, with her face pink with the effort, approached him timidly. "Oh, sir, could you chop it so we could have the top?" The man looked kindly at the 2 earnest faces and at the toys in the little cold hands. "Of course I could," he said heartily. "How much of the top will you be wanting?" "Oh, just a little piece," said Sadie. "We haven't very much to put on it." "How will you carry it?" asked the man when he had finished. "On my sled," said Jimmy, exhibiting with pride a box on runners made by himself. "Wait a minute," said the man, after the balls had been carefully stowed away at the bottom on a soft bed of branches, and the tree placed on top. "I have something inside you will like." And going into the house, he reappeared with 2 bright cornucopias of candy, a nice red apple and an orange. "Oh, thank you, thank you!" cried the children. "What a Christmas Billy will have!" "Who's Billy?" asked the man. "He is the baby of our house. His mother rents the back room on the top floor. They're poor, too, and we love Billy. Sadie takes care of him in the daytime when his mother gets work, and she's a splendid nurse," said Jimmy with pride. Then, with nods and smiles, they started. The man watched them until they disappeared, and then, with a half-sigh, returned to his chopping. "I wish I'd asked where they lived. I would like to have seen the tree and Billy," he thought, but it was too late. The ragged pair and the old sled with its cheery burden had gone round the corner. "And what of our friends, the Balls, down in their nest of pine boughs?" They were too happy to speak. The events of the night, passed among ashes and bits of coal, had told much on their delicate nerves, and the sudden change to the fragrant bed, with a prospect of another tree ahead of them, was as cheering to them as it was to the children. All pride had gone, and there was left only a strong desire to make such a brave appearance that Billy's tree would be the best and brightest in the land, notwithstanding the fact that the ornaments were few. And it was a bright little tree, set up in a starch box, with the balls hung where they showed to the best advantage, and the paper dolly tied fast to the top bough, where her tattered skirts were less noticeable, and no one minded, or even thought, that she had only one wing. The gold balls glistened as good as new when the dust was rubbed off, and when later the candle had burned out, The apple and the orange had been divided and eaten, and the festivities were over. The little pink ball rejoiced to find herself going to bed with the fat baby. Then, clasped tight in the hot little hand and nestling close to the pink cheek, she sent up a little prayer of thanks to the Christmas angel, which was as near saying real prayers as a Christmas tree ornament ever comes. End of Part 6. Part 7. The Appositeness of Christmas, in The Feast of St. Friend, 1911, by Arnold Bennett. Yes, you say, I am quite at one with you as to the immense importance of goodwill in social existence, and I have the same faith in it as you have. But why a festival? Why eating and drinking and ceremonies? Surely one can have faith without festivals. The answer is that one cannot, or at least that in practice one never does. A disinclination for festivals, a morbid self-conscious fear of letting oneself go, is a sure sign of lack of faith. If you have not enough enthusiasm for the cult of goodwill to make you positively desire to celebrate the cult, then your faith is insufficient and needs fostering by study and meditation. Why, if you decide to found a sailing club up your creek, your very first thought is to signalize your faith in the sailing of those particular waters by a dinner and a jollity, and you take care that the event shall be an annual one. You have faith in your wife and in your affection for her. Surely you don't need a festival to remind you of that faith, you so superior to human weaknesses? But you do. You insist on having it, and if the festival did not happen, you would feel gloomy and discouraged. A birthday is a device for recalling to you in a formal and impressive manner that a certain person still lives and is in need of goodwill. It is a device which experience has proved to be both valuable and necessary. Real faith effervesces. It shoots forth in every direction. It communicates itself, and the inevitable result is a festival. The festival is anticipated with pleasure, and it is remembered with pleasure. And thus it reacts stimulatingly on that which gave it birth, as the vitality of children reacts stimulatingly on the vitality of parents. It provides a concrete symbol of that which is invisible and intangible, and mankind is not yet so advanced in the path of spiritual perfection that we can afford to dispense with concrete symbols. Now, if we maintain festivals and formalities for the healthy continuance and honor of a pastime or of a personal affection, shall we not maintain a festival, and a mighty one, in behalf of a faith which makes the corporate human existence bearable amid the menaces and mysteries that forever threaten it, the faith of universal goodwill and mutual confidence? If, then, there is to be a festival, why should it not be the festival of Christmas? It can indeed be no other. Christmas is most plainly indicated. It is dignified and made precious by traditions which go back much further than the Christian era, and it has this tremendous advantage: it exists. In spite of our declining faith, it has been preserved to us, and here it is, ready to hand. Not merely does it fall at the point which uncounted generations have agreed to consider as the turn of the solar year and as the rebirth of hope, it falls also immediately before the end of the calendar year, and thus prepares us for a fresh beginning that shall put the old to shame. It could not be better timed. Further, its traditional spirit of peace and goodwill is the very spirit which we desire to foster. And finally, its customs, or at any rate its main customs, are well designed to symbolize that spirit. If we have allowed the dispatch of Christmas cards to degenerate into naught but a tedious shuffling of pasteboards and overwork of post-office officials, the fault is not in the custom, but in ourselves. The custom is a most striking one, so long as we have sufficient imagination to remember vividly that we are all in the same boat, I mean on the same planet, and clinging desperately to the flying ball, and dependent for daily happiness on one another's goodwill. A Christmas card sent by one human being to another human being is more than a piece of colored stationery sent by one log of wood to another log of wood. It is an inspiring and reassuring message of high value. The mischief is that so many self-styled human beings are just logs of wood, rather stylishly dressed. And then the custom of present-giving. What better and more convincing proof of sympathy than a gift? The gift is one of these obvious contrivances, like the wheel or the lever, which smooth and simplify earthly life, and the charm of whose utility no obviousness can stale. But, of course, any contrivance can be rendered futile by clumsiness or negligence. There is a sort of Christmas-giver who says pettishly, "Oh, I don't know what to give to so-and-so this Christmas. What a bother! I shall write and tell her to choose something herself and send the bill to me." And he writes. And though he does not suspect it, what he really writes, and what so-and-so reads, is this: "Dear so-and-so, it is nothing to me that you and I are alive together on this planet, and in various ways mutually dependent. But I am bound by custom to give you a present. I do not, however, take sufficient interest in your life to know what object it would give you pleasure to possess, and I do not want to be put to the trouble of finding out, nor of obtaining the object and transmitting it to you. Will you, therefore, buy something for yourself and send the bill to me? Of course, a sense of social decency will prevent you from spending more than a small sum, and I shall be spared all exertion beyond signing a cheque. Yours insincerely and loggishly, blank." So managed, the contrivance of present-giving becomes positively sinister in its working. But managed with the sympathetic imagination which is infallibly produced by real faith in goodwill, its efficacy may approach the miraculous. The Christmas ceremony of good-wishing by word of mouth has never been in any danger of falling into insincerity. Such is the power of tradition and virtue of a festival, and such the instinctive brotherliness of men, that on this day the mere sight of an acquaintance will soften the voice and warm the heart of the most superior skeptic and curmudgeon that the age of disillusion has produced. In spite of himself, faith flickers up in him again, be it only for a moment, and during that moment he is almost like those whose bright faith the age has never tarnished, like the great and like the simple, to whom it is quite unnecessary to offer a defence and explanation of Christmas, or to suggest the basis of a new faith therein. End of Part 7. McAllister's Christmas, in McAllister and His Double, 1905, by Arthur Train. 1. McAllister was out of sorts. All the afternoon he had sat in the club window and watched the Christmas shoppers hurrying by with their bundles. He thanked God he had no brats to buy moo cows and bow-wows for. The very nonchalance of these victims of a fate that had given them families irritated him. McAllister was a clubman, pure and simple. That is to say, though neither simple nor pure, he was a clubman and nothing more. He had occupied the same seat by the same window during the greater part of his earthly existence, and they were the same seat and window that his father had filled before him. His select and exclusive circle called him Chubby, and his 45 years of terrapin and cocktails had given him a graceful rotundity of person that did not belie the name. They had also endowed him with a cheerful, though somewhat florid countenance, and a permanent sense of well-being. As the afternoon wore on and the pedestrians became fewer, McAllister sank deeper and deeper into gloom. The club was deserted. Everybody had gone out of town to spend Christmas with someone else, and the Winthrops, on whom he had counted for a certainty, had failed for some reason to invite him. He had waited confidently until the last minute, and now he was stranded alone. It began to snow softly, gently. McAllister threw himself disconsolately into a leathern armchair by the smouldering logs on the 6-foot hearth. A servant in livery entered, pulled down the shades, and after touching a button that threw a subdued radiance over the room, withdrew noiselessly. "Come back here, Peter," growled McAllister. "Anybody in the club?" "Only Mr. Tomlinson, sir." McAllister swore under his breath. "Yes, sir," replied Peter. McAllister shot a quick glance at him. "I didn't say anything. You may go." This time Peter got almost to the door. Peter, ask Mr. Tomlinson if he will dine with me." Peter presently returned with the intelligence that Mr. Tomlinson would be delighted. "Of course," grumbled McAllister to himself, "no one ever knew Tomlinson to refuse anything." He ordered dinner, and then took up an evening paper, in which an effort had been made to conceal the absence of news by summarizing the achievements of the past year. Staring headlines invited his notice to "A Year of Progress." "What the Tenement House Commission has accomplished." "Further need of prison reform." He threw down the paper in disgust. This reform made him sick. Tenements and prisons! Why were the papers always talking about tenements and prisons? They were a great deal better than the people who lived in them deserved. He recalled Wilkins, his valet, who had stolen his black pearl scarf-pin. It increased his ill humor. Hang Wilkins! The thief was probably out by this time and wearing the pin. It had been a matter of jest among his friends that the servant had looked not unlike his master. McAllister winced at the thought. "Dinner is served," said Peter. An hour and a half later, Tomlinson and McAllister, having finished a sumptuous repast, stared stupidly at each other across their liqueurs. They were stuffed and bored. Tomlinson was a thin man who knew everything positively. McAllister hated him. He always felt when in his company like the woman who invariably answered her husband's remarks by "'Tain't so, it's just the opposite." Tomlinson was trying to make conversation by repeating assertively what he had read in the evening press. "Now, our prisons," he announced authoritatively, "why, it is outrageous. The people are crowded in like cattle. The food is loathsome. It's a disgrace to a civilized city." That was the last straw to McAllister. "Look here," he snapped back at Tomlinson, who shrank behind his cigar at the vehemence of the attack. "What do you know about it? I tell you it's all rot. It's all politics. Our tenements are all right, and so are our prisons. The law of supply and demand regulates the tenements, and who pays for the prisons, I'd like to know? We pay for 'em, and the scamps that rob us live in 'em for nothing. The Tombs is a great deal better than most second-class hotels on the Continent. I know. I had a valet once that—oh, what's the use? I'd be glad to spend Christmas in no worse place. Reform! Stuff! Don't tell me!" He sank back, purple in his face. "Oh, of course, if you know—" Tomlinson hesitated politely, remembering that McAllister had signed for the dinner. "Well, I do know," affirmed McAllister. 2. "Noel, Noel, Noel, Noel," sang out the bells as McAllister left the club at 12 o'clock and started down the avenue. "Noel, Noel," hummed McAllister. Pretty old air, he thought. He had almost forgotten that it was Christmas morning. As he felt his way gingerly over the stone sidewalks, the bells were ringing all around him. First one chime and then another. "Noel, Noel, Noel, Noel." They ceased, leaving the melody floating on the moist night air. The snow began to fall irregularly in patchy flakes, then gradually turned to rain. First a soft, wet mist that dimmed the electric lights and shrouded the hotel windows. then a fine sprinkle, at last the chill rain of a winter's night. McAllister turned up his coat collar and looked about for a cab. It was too late. He hurried hastily down the avenue. Soon a welcome sight met his eye, a coupé, a nighthawk, crawling slowly down the block, on the lookout, no doubt, for belated Christmas revelers. Without superfluous introduction, McAllister made a dive for the door, shouted his address, and jumped inside. The driver, but half aroused from his lethargy, muttered something unintelligible and pulled in his horse. At the same moment the dark figure of a man swiftly emerged from a side street, ran up to the cab, opened the door, threw in a heavy object upon McAllister's feet, and followed it with himself. "Let her go!" he cried, slamming the door. The driver, without hesitation, lashed his horse and started at a furious gallop down the slippery avenue. Then, for the first time, the stranger perceived McAllister. There was a muttered curse, a gleam of steel as they flashed by a street lamp, and the clubman felt the cold muzzle of a revolver against his cheek. "Speak, and I'll blow your head off." The cab swayed and swerved in all directions, and the driver retained his seat with difficulty. McAllister, clinging to the sides of the rocking vehicle, expected every moment to be either shot or thrown out and killed. "Don't move," hissed his companion. McAllister tried with difficulty not to move. Suddenly there came a shrill whistle, followed by the clatter of hoofs. A figure on horseback dashed by. The driver, endeavoring to rein in his now maddened beast, lost his balance and pitched overboard. There was a confusion of shouts, a blue flash, a loud report. The horse sprang into the air and fell, kicking, upon the pavement. The cab crashed upon its side. Amid a shower of glass, the door parted company with its hinges, and the stranger, placing his heel on McAllister's stomach, leaped quickly into the darkness. A moment later, having recovered a part of his scattered senses, our hero, thrusting himself through the shattered framework of the cab, staggered to his feet. He remembered dimly afterward having expected to create a mild sensation among the spectators by announcing, in response to their polite inquiries as to his safety, that he was quite uninjured. Instead, however, the glare of a policeman's lantern was turned upon his disheveled countenance, and a hoarse voice shouted, "Throw up your hands!" He threw them up. Like the phoenix rising from its ashes, McAllister emerged from the debris which surrounded him. On either side of the cab he beheld a policeman with a levelled revolver. A mounted officer stood sentinel beside the smoking body of the horse. "No tricks now," continued the voice. "Pull your feet out of that mess and keep your hands up. Slip on the nippers, Tom. Better go through 'em here. They always manage to lose something going over." McAllister wondered where "over" was. Before he could protest, he was unceremoniously seated upon the body of the dead horse, and the officers were going rapidly through his clothes. "Thought so," muttered Tom, as he drew out of McAllister's coat pocket a revolver and a jimmy. "Just as well to unballast 'em at the start." A black calico mask and a small bottle filled with a colorless liquid followed. Tom drew a quick breath. "So you're one of those, are you?" he added with an oath. The victim of this astonishing adventure had not yet spoken. Now he stammered, "Look here, what do you think I am? This is all a mistake." Tom did not deign to reply. The officer on horseback had dismounted and was poking among the pieces of cab. "What's this here?" he inquired, as he dragged a large bundle covered with black cloth into the circle of light, and, untying a bit of cord, poured its contents upon the pavement. A glittering silver service rolled out upon the asphalt and reflected the glow of the lanterns. "Gee, look at all the swag!" cried Tom. "I wonder where he melts it up." Faintly at first, then nearer and nearer, came the harsh clanging of the hurry-up wagon. "Get up!" ordered Tom, punctuating his order with mild kicks. Then, as the driver reined up the panting horses alongside, the officer grabbed his prisoner by the coat collar and yanked him to his feet. "Jump in," he said roughly. "My God!" exclaimed our friend half aloud. "Where are they going to take me?" "To the Tombs for Christmas," answered Tom. 3. McAllister, hatless, stumbled into the wagon and was thrust forcibly into a corner. Above the steady drum of the rain upon the waterproof cover, he could hear the officers outside packing up the silverware and discussing their capture. The hot japanned tin of the wagon lamps smelled abominably. The heavy breathing of the horses, together with the sickening odor of rubber and damp straw, told him that this was no dream, but a frightful reality. "He's a bad un," came Tom's voice in tones of caution. "You can see his lay is the gentleman's racket. Wait till he gets to the precinct and hear the steer he'll give the sergeant. He's a wise un, and don't you forget it." As the wagon started, the officers swung on to the steps behind. McAllister, crouching in the straw by the driver's seat, tried to understand what had happened. Apart from a few bruises and a cut on his forehead, he had escaped injury, and, while considerably shaken up, was physically little the worse for his adventure. His head, however, ached badly. What he suffered from most was a new and strange sensation of helplessness. It was as if he had stepped into another world, in which he, McAllister of the Colophon Club, did not belong, and the language of which he did not speak. The ignominy of his position crushed him. Never again, should this disgrace become known, could he bring himself to enter the portals of the club. To be the hero of an exciting adventure with a burglar in a runaway cab was one matter, but to be arrested, haled to prison, and locked up was quite another. Once before the proper authorities, it would be simple enough to explain who and what he was, but the question that troubled him was how to avoid publicity. He remembered the bills in his pocket. Fortunately, they were still there. In spite of the handcuffs, he wormed them out and surreptitiously held up the roll. The guard started visibly, and, turning away his head, allowed McAllister to thrust the wad into his hand. "Can't I square this somehow?" whispered our hero hesitatingly. The guard broke into a loud guffaw. "Get on to him," he laughed. "He's at it already, Tom. Look at the dough he put out of his pants. You're right about his lay." He turned fiercely upon McAllister, who, dazed by this sudden turn of affairs, once more retreated into his corner. The three officers counted the money ostentatiously by the light of a lantern. 80 plunks! Thought we was cheap, didn't he?" remarked the guard scornfully. "No, 80 plunks won't square this job for you. It'll take nearer 8 years. No more monkey business now. You've struck the wrong combine." McAllister saw that he had been guilty of a terrible faux pas. Any explanation to these officers was clearly impossible. With an official it would be different. He had once met a police commissioner at dinner, and remembered that he had seemed really almost like a gentleman. The wagon drew up at a police station, and presently McAllister found himself in a small room, at one end of which iron bars ran from floor to ceiling. A kerosene lamp cast a dim light over a weather-beaten desk, behind which, half asleep, reclined an officer on night duty. A single other chair and 4 large octagonal stone receptacles were the only remaining furniture. The man behind the desk opened his eyes, yawned, and stared stupidly at the officers. A clock directly overhead struck 1 with harsh, vibrant clang. "What you got?" inquired the sergeant. "A second story, man," answered the guard. "He took to a cab," exclaimed Tom, "and him and his partner give us a fierce chase down the avenue. O'Halloran shot the horse, and the cab was well knocked to hell. The other fellow clawed out before we could nab him, but we got this one all right." "Hi there, McCarthy!" shouted the sergeant to someone in the dim vast beyond. "Come and open up." He examined McAllister with a degree of interest. "Quite a swell guy," he commented. "Them dress clothes must have been real pretty onct." McAllister stood with soaked and rumpled hair, hatless and collarless, his coat torn and splashed, and his shirt bosom bloody and covered with mud. He wanted to cry, for the first time in 35 years. "What's your name?" asked the sergeant. The prisoner remained stiffly mute. He would have suffered anything rather than disclose himself. "Where do you live?" Still no answer. The sergeant gave vent to a grim laugh. "Mama!" He scribbled something in the blotter upon the desk before him. Then he raised his eyes and scrutinized McAllister's face. Suddenly he jumped to his feet. "Well, of all the luck!" he exclaimed. "Do you know who you've caught? It's Fatty Welch." 4. How he had managed to live through the night that followed, McAllister could never afterward understand. Locked in a cell, alone to be sure, but with no light, he took off his dripping coat and threw himself on the wooden seat that served for a bed. It was about 6 inches too short. He lay there for a few moments, then got wearily to his feet and began to pace up and down the narrow cell. His legs and abdomen, which had been the recipients of so much attention, pained him severely. The occupant of the next apartment, awakened by our friend's arrival, began to show irritation. He ordered McAllister, in no gentle language, to abstain from exercise and go to sleep. A woman farther down the corridor commenced to moan drearily to herself. Evidently sleep had made her forget her sorrow, but now, in the middle of the night, it came back to her with redoubled force. Her groans racked McAllister's heart. A stir ran all along the cells, sounds of people tossing restlessly, curses, all the nameless noises of the jail. McAllister, fearful of bringing some new calamity upon his head, sat down. He had been shivering when he came in. Now he reeked with perspiration. The air was fetid. The only ventilation came through the gratings of the door, and a huge stove just beyond his cell rendered the temperature almost unbearable. He began to throw off his garments one by one. Again he drew his knees to his chest and tried to sleep, but sleep was impossible. Never had McAllister in all his life known such wretchedness of body, such abject physical suffering. But his agony of mind was even more unbearable. Vague apprehension of infectious disease floating in the nauseous air, or of possible pneumonia, unnerved and tortured him. Stretched on the floor, he fell at length into a coma of exhaustion, in which he fancied that he was lying in a warm bath in the porcelain tub at home. In the room beyond, he could see Fraser, his valet, laying out his pajamas and dressing-gown. There was a delicious odor of that violet perfume he always used. In a minute he would jump into bed. Then the valet suddenly came into the bathroom and began to pound his master on the back of the neck. For some reason he did not resent this. It seemed quite natural and proper. He merely put up his hand to ward off the blows, and found the keeper standing over him. "Here's some breakfast," remarked that official. "Tom sent out and got it for you. The city don't supply no aller carty." McAllister vaguely rubbed his eyes. The keeper shut and locked the door, leaving behind him on the seat a tin mug of scalding hot coffee and a half-loaf of sour bread. McAllister arose and felt his clothes. They were entirely dry, but had shrunk perceptibly. He was surprised to find that, save for the dizziness in his head, he felt not unlike himself. Moreover, he was most abominably hungry. He knelt down and smelt of the contents of the tin cup. It did not smell like coffee at all. It tasted like a combination of hot water, tea, and molasses. He waited until it had cooled and drank it. The bread was not so bad. McAllister ate it all. There was a good deal of noise in the cells now, and outside he could hear many feet coming and going. Occasionally a draught of cold air would flow in, and an officer would tramp down the corridor and remove one of the occupants of the row. His watch showed that it was already 8 o'clock. He fumbled in his waistcoat pocket and found a very warped and wrinkled cigar. His matchbox supplied the necessary light, and chubby McAllister began to smoke his after-breakfast Havana with appreciation. "No smoking in the cells," came the rough voice of the keeper. "Give us that cigar, Welch." McAllister started to his feet. "Hand it over now, quick." The clubman passed his cherished comforter through the bars, and the keeper, thrusting it, still lighted, into his own mouth, grinned at him, winked, and walked away. "Merry Christmas, Fatty," he remarked genially, over his shoulder. 5. Half an hour later, Tom and his side partner came to the cell door. They were flushed with victory. Already the morning papers contained accounts of the pursuit and startling arrest of Fatty Welch, the well-known crook, who was wanted in Pennsylvania and elsewhere on various charges. Altogether, the officers were in a very genial frame of mind. "Come along, Fatty," said Tom, helping the clubman into his bedraggled overcoat. "We're almost late for roll call, as it is." They left the cells and entered the station house proper, where several officers with their prisoners were waiting. "We'll take you down to headquarters and make sure we've got you right," he continued. "I guess Sheridan'll know you fast enough when he sees you. Come on, boys." He opened the door and led the way across the sidewalk to the patrol wagon, which stood backed against the curb. It was a glorious winter's day. The sharp, frosty air stimulated the clubman's jaded senses and gave him new hope. He felt sure that at headquarters he would find some person to whom he could safely confide the secret of his identity. In about 10 minutes the wagon stopped in a narrow street before an inhospitable-looking building. "Here's the old place," remarked one of the load cheerfully. "Looks just the same as ever. Mott Street's not a mite different, and to think I ain't been here in 15 years." All clambered out, and each officer, selecting his prisoners, conveyed them down a flight of steps, through a door, several feet below the level of the sidewalk, and into a small, stuffy chamber full of men smoking and lounging. Most of these seemed to take a friendly interest in the clubman, a few accosting him by his now familiar alias. Tom hurried McAllister along a dark corridor, out into a cold courtyard, across the cobblestones, into another door, through a hall lighted only by a dim gas-jet, and then up a flight of winding stairs. McAllister's head whirled. Then quickly they were at the top, and in a huge, high-ceilinged room crowded with men in civilian dress. On one side, upon a platform, stood a nondescript row of prisoners, at whom the thronging upon the floor gazed in silence. Above the heads of this file of motley individuals could be read the gold lettering upon the cabinet behind them, "Rogues' Gallery." On the other side of the room, likewise upon a platform and behind a long desk, stood 2 officers in uniform, one of them an inspector, engaged in studying with the keenest attention the human exhibition opposite. "Get up there, Fatty." Before he realized what had happened, McAllister was pushed upon the platform at the end of the line. His appearance created a little wave of excitement, which increased when his comrades of the wagon joined him. It was a peculiar scene. 20 men standing up for inspection, some gazing unconcernedly before them, some glaring defiantly at their observers, and others grinning recognition at familiar faces. McAllister grew cold with fright. Several of the detectives pointed at him and nodded. Out of the silence the inspector's voice came with the shock of thunder. "Hey there, you Sanders, hold up your hand." A short man near the head of the line lifted his arm. "Take off your hat." The prisoner removed his headgear with his other hand. The inspector raised his voice and addressed the crowd of detectives, who turned with one accord to examine the subject of his discourse. "That's Biff Sanders, con man and all-around thief. Served 2 terms up the river for grand larceny. Last time an 8-year bit. That was 9 years ago. Take a good look at him. I want you to remember his face. Put your hat on." Sanders resumed his original position, his face expressing the most complete indifference. A slight, good-looking young man now joined the inspector and directed his attention to the prisoner next the clubman, the same being who had remarked upon the familiar appearance of Mott Street. "Hold up your hand," ordered the inspector. "You're Muggins, aren't you? Haven't been here in 15 years, have you?" The man smiled. "You're right, Inspector," he said. "The last time was in '89. That's Muggins, burglar and sneak." Served 4 terms here, and then got settled for life in Louisville for murder. Pardoned after he'd served 4 years. Look at him." Thus the curious proceeding continued, each man in the line being inspected, recognized, and his record and character described by the inspector to the assembled Bureau of Detectives. No other voice was heard save the harsh tones of some prisoner in reply. Then the inspector looked at McAllister. "Welch, hold up your hand." McAllister shuddered. If he refused, he knew not what might happen to him. He had heard of the horrors of the 3rd degree, and associated it with starvation, the rack, and all kinds of brutality. They might set upon him in a body. He might be mobbed, beaten, strangled. And yet, if he obeyed, would it not be a public admission that he was the mysterious and elusive Welch? Would it not bind the chains more firmly about him, and render explanation all the more difficult? "Do you hear? Hold up your hand, and be quick about it." His hand went up of its own accord. The inspector cleared his throat and rapped upon the railing. "Take a good look at this man. He's Fatty Welch, one of the cleverest thieves in the country. Does a little of everything. Began as a valet to a clubman in this city. He got settled for stealing a valuable pin about 3 years ago, and served a short term up the river. Since then he's been all over. His game is to secure employment in fashionable houses as butler or servant, and then get away with the jewelry. He's wanted for a big job down in Pennsylvania. Take a good look at him. When he gets out, we don't want him around these parts. I'd like you precinct men to remember him." The detectives crowded near to get a close view of the interesting criminal. 1 or 2 of them made notes in memorandum books. The slender man had a hasty conference with the inspector. "The officer who has Welch, take him up to the gallery, and then bring him down to the record room," directed the inspector. "Get down, Fatty," commanded Tom. McAllister, stupefied with horror, embarrassment, and apprehension of the possibilities in store for him, stepped down and followed like a somnambulist. As they made their way to the elevator, he could hear the strident voice of the inspector beginning again. "This is Pat Hogan, otherwise known as Paddy the Sneak, and his side partner, Jim Hawkins, who goes under the name of James Hawkinson. His pals call him Supple Jim. 2 of the cleverest sneaks in the country. They branch out into strong-arm work occasionally." The elevator began to ascend. "You seem kinder down," commented Tom. "I suppose you expect to get settled for quite a bit down to Philadelphia, huh? Well, don't talk unless you feel like it. Here we are." They got out upon an upper floor and crossed the hall. On their left a matron was arranging rows of tiny chairs in a small schoolroom or nursery. At any other time the lost children's room might have aroused a flicker of interest in McAllister, but he felt none whatever in it now. Tom opened a door and pushed the clubman gently into a small, low-ceilinged chamber. Charts and diagrams of the human cranium hung on one wall, while a score of painted eyes, each of a different color, and each bearing a technical appellation and a number, stared from the other. Upon a small square platform, about 8 inches in height, stood a half-clad Italian, congealed with terror, and expecting momentarily to receive a shock of electricity. The slender young man was rapidly measuring his hands and feet, and calling out the various dimensions to an assistant, who recorded them upon a card. This accomplished, he ordered his victim down from the block, seated him unceremoniously in a chair, and with a pair of shining instruments gauged the depth of his skull from front to rear, its width between the cheekbones, and the length of the ears, describing all the while the other features in brief terms to his associate. "Now, off with you," he ejaculated. "Here, lug this greaser in and mug him." The officer in the case hailed the Italian, shrieking, into another room. "Ah, Fatty," remarked the slender man, "I trust you won't object to these little formalities. Take off that left shoe, if you please." McAllister's soul had shriveled within him. His powers of thought had been annihilated. Mechanically he removed the shoe in question and placed his foot upon the block. The young man quickly measured it. Now get up there and rest your hand on the board." McAllister observed that the table bore the painted outline of a human hand. He did as he was told, unquestioningly. The other measured his forefinger and the length of his forearm. "All right. Now sit down and let me tickle your head for a moment." The operator took the silver calipers, which had just been used upon the Italian, and ran them thoughtfully forward and back above the clubman's organs of hearing. "By George, you've got a big head," remarked the measurer. "Prominent, Roman nose, number 4 eyes. Thank you. Just step into the next room, will you, and be mugged." McAllister drew on his shoe and followed Tom into the adjoining chamber of horrors. "No tricks now," commented the officer in charge of the instrument. Snap went the camera. "Turn sideways. Snap. That's all." The clubman staggered to his feet. He entirely failed to appreciate the extent of the indignity which had been practiced upon him. It was hours before he realized that he had actually been measured and photographed as a criminal, and that, to his dying hour and beyond, these insignia of his shame would remain locked in the custody of the police. "Where now?" he asked. "Time to go over to court," answered Tom. "The wagon'll wait for us, but first we'll drop in on Sheridan. Record room man, you know." "Isn't there some way I can see the commissioner?" inquired McAllister. Tom burst into a roar of laughter. "You have got a gall," he commented, thumping his prisoner good-naturedly in the middle of the back. "The commissioner! Ho! That's a good one. I guess we'll have to make it the warden. Come on now, and quit your joshing." Once more they entered the main room, where the detectives were congregated. The inspector was still at it. There had been a big haul the night before. He intended running all the crooks out of town by New Year's Day. Tom shoved McAllister through the crush, across an adjoining room, and finally into a tiny office. A young man with a genial countenance was sitting at a desk by the single window. He looked up as they crossed the threshold. "Hello, Welsh, how goes it? Let's see, how long is it since you were here?" Somehow this quiet, gentlemanly fellow, with his confident method of address, telling you just who you were, irritated McAllister to the explosive point. "I'm not Welsh," he cried indignantly. "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Mr. Sheridan. "Pray, who are you?" "You'll find out soon enough," answered McAllister sullenly. "Look here," remarked the other, "don't imagine you can bluff us. If you think you are not Welsh, perhaps I can persuade you to change your mind." He turned to an officer who stood in the doorway of a large vault. "Bring 2,208, if you please." The officer pulled out a drawer, removed a long linen envelope, and spread out its contents upon the desk. There were 15 or 20 newspaper clippings, at least one of which was embellished with an evil-looking woodcut. "Let's see," continued Mr. Sheridan, "you began with a year up the river, took a pearl pin from a man named McAllister. Then you turned several tricks in Chicago, St. Louis, Buffalo, and Philadelphia, and got away with it every time. Have we got you right?" McAllister ground his teeth. "You have not," said he. "Look at yourself," continued the other. "There's your face. You can't deny it. I wonder the inspector didn't have you measured and photographed the first time you were settled. Still, the picture's enough." He handed the clubman a newspaper clipping containing a visage which undeniably resembled the features which the latter saw daily in his mirror. McAllister wearily shook his head. "Well," said the expert, "of course you don't have to tell us anything unless you want to. We've got you right. That's enough." He pushed the clippings back into the envelope, handed it to the officer, and turned away. "Come on," ordered Tom. Once more McAllister and his mentor availed themselves of the only free transportation offered by the city government, that of the patrol wagon, and were soon deposited at the side entrance of the Jefferson Market Police Court. A group of curious idlers watched their descent and disappearance into what must have at all times seemed to them a concrete and ever-present temporal Avernus. The why and wherefore of these erratic trips were, of course, unknown to McAllister. Presumably he must be some rara avis of crime, whose feet have been caught inadvertently in the limed twig set by the official fowler for more homely poultry. Fatty Welch, whoever he might be, apparently enjoyed the respect incident to success in any line of human endeavor. It seemed likewise that his presence was much desired in the sister city of Philadelphia, in which direction the clubman had a vague fear of being unwillingly transported. He did not, of course, realize that he was held primarily as a violator of the law of his own state, and hence must answer to the charge in the magistrate's court nearest the locus of his supposed offense. Inside the station-house, Tom held a few moments' converse with one of its grizzled guardians, and then led our hero along a passage and opened a door. But here McAllister shrank back. It was his first sight of that great cosmopolitan institution, the police court. Before him lay the scene of which he had so often read in the newspapers. The big room, with its Gothic windows, was filled to overflowing with every variety of the human species, who not only taxed the seating capacity of the benches to the utmost, but near the doors were packed into a solid, impenetrable mass. Upon a platform behind a desk a square-jawed man with chin-whiskers disposed rapidly of the file of dependents brought before him. A long line of officers, each with one or more prisoners, stood upon the judge's left, and as fast as the business of one was concluded, the next pushed forward. McAllister perceived that at best only a few moments could elapse before he was brought to face the charge against him, and that he must make up his mind quickly what course of action to pursue. As he stepped down from the doorway, there was a perceptible flutter among the spectators. Several hungry-looking men with notebooks opened them, and poised their pencils expectantly. Tom, having handed over McAllister to the temporary care of a brother officer, lost no time in locating his complainant, that is to say, the gentleman whose house our hero was charged with having burglariously entered. The two then sought out the clerk, who seemed to be holding a sort of little preliminary court of his own, and who, under the officer's instruction, drew up some formal document to which the complainant signed his name. McAllister was now brought before this official, and briefly informed that anything he might say would be used against him at his trial. He was then interrogated, as before, in regard to his name, age, residence, and occupation, but with the same result. Indeed, no answers seemed to be expected under the circumstances, and the clerk, having written something upon the paper, waved them aside. Nothing, however, of these proceedings had been lost to the reporters, who escorted Tom and McAllister to the end of the line of officers, worrying the former for information as to his prisoner's origin and past performances. But Tom motioned them off with the papers which he held in his hand, bidding them await the final action of the magistrate. Nobody seemed particularly unfriendly. In fact, an air of general good fellowship pervaded the entire routine going on around them. What impressed the clubman most was the persistence and omnipresence of the reporters. "I must get time," thought McAllister. "I must get time." One after another, the victims of the varied delights of too much Christmas jubilation were disposed of. Fatty Welch was the only real gun that had been taken. He had the arena practically to himself. Now only one case intervened. He braced himself and tried to steady his nerves. "Next! What's this?" McAllister was thrust down below the bridge facing the bench, and Tom began hastily to describe the circumstances of the arrest. "Fatty Welch?" interrupted the magistrate. "Oh, yes, I read about it in the morning papers. Chased off in a cab, didn't he? You shot the horse, and his partner got away. Wanted in Pennsylvania and Illinois, you say? That's enough." Then, looking down at McAllister, who stood before him in bespattered dress suit and fragmentary linen, he inquired, "Have you counsel?" McAllister made no answer. If he proclaimed who he was and demanded an immediate hearing, the harpies of the press would fill the papers with full accounts of his episode. His incognito must be preserved at any cost. Whatever action he might decide to take, this was not the time and place. A better opportunity would undoubtedly present itself later in the day. "You are charged with the crime of burglary," continued the judge, "and it is further alleged that you are a fugitive from justice in 2 other states. What have you to say for yourself?" McAllister sought the judge's eye in vain. "I have nothing to say," he replied faintly. There was a renewed scratching of pens. The judge conferred with the clerk for a moment. "Any question of the prisoner's identity?" he asked. "Oh, no," replied Tom conclusively. "The fact is, your honor, we took him by accident, as you may say. We laid a plant for a feller doing second-story work on the avenue, and when we nabbed him, who should it be but Welch? You see, they wired on his description from Philadelphia a couple weeks ago, but we couldn't find hide or hair of him in the city, and had about give up looking. Then, quite unexpected, we scoops him in. Here's his identity," handing the judge a soiled telegraph blank. "It's him, all right," he added with a grin. The magistrate glanced at the form and at McAllister. "Seems to fit," he commented. "Have you looked for the scar?" Tom laughed. "Sure. I seen it when he was getting his measurements took down to headquarters. Turn around, Welch. Let's see your neck," directed the magistrate. The clubman turned round and displayed his collarless neck. "There it is!" exclaimed Tom. McAllister mechanically put his hand to his neck and turned faint. He had had in his childhood an almost forgotten fall, and the scar was still there. He experienced a genuine thrill of horror. "Well," continued the magistrate, "the prisoner is entitled to counsel, and besides, I am sure that the complainant, Mr. Brown, has no desire to be delayed here on Christmas Day. I will set the hearing for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the Tombs Police Court. I shall be sitting there for Judge Mason the rest of the week, sitting tomorrow, and will take the case along with me. You might suggest to the warden that it would be more convenient to send the prisoner down to the Tombs so that there need be no delay." The complainant bowed, and the officer at the bridge slapped McAllister, not unkindly, upon the back. "You'll need a pretty good lawyer," he remarked with a wink. "Next," ordered the judge. In the patrol wagon, McAllister had ample time for reflection. A motley collection of tramps, disorderlies, and petty law-breakers filled the seats and crowded the aisle. They all talked and joked, swinging from side to side and clutching at one another for support, with harsh outbursts of profanity, as they rattled down the deserted streets toward New York's Bastille. Staggering for a foothold between 4 women of the town, McAllister was forced to breathe the fumes of alcohol, the odor of musk, and the aroma of foul linen. He no longer felt innocent. The sense of guilt was upon him. He seemed part and parcel of this load of miserable humanity. The wagon clattered over the cobblestones of Elm Street and, whirling round, backed up to the door of the Tombs. The low, massive Egyptian structure, surrounded by a high stone wall, seemed like a gigantic mortuary vault waiting to receive the civilly dead. Warden and keepers were ready for the prisoners, who were now unceremoniously bundled out and hustled inside. McAllister stood with the others in a small anteroom leading directly into the lowest tier. He could hear the ceaseless shuffling of feet and the subdued murmur of voices, rising and falling, but continuous, like the twittering of a multitude of birds, while through the bars came the fetid prison smell, with a new and disagreeable element, the odor of prison food. "Keeping your mouth shut?" remarked the deputy to McAllister, as he entered the words, "Prisoner refuses to answer," and blotted them. "We're rather crowded just now," he added apologetically. "I guess I'll send you to Murderers' Row. Hello there," he called to someone above. "One for the first tier." A keeper seized the clubman by the arm, opened a door in the steel grating, and pushed him through. "Go along up," he ordered. McAllister started wearily up the stairs. At the top of the flight he came to another door, behind which stood another keeper. In the background marched in ceaseless procession an irregular file of men. In the gloom they looked like ghosts. Aimlessly they walked on, one behind the other, most of them with eyes downcast, wordless, taking that exercise of the body which the law prescribed. McAllister entered the den of beasts. "All right, Jimmy," yelled the keeper to the deputy warden below. Then, turning to McAllister, "I'm going to put you in with Davidson. He's quiet and won't bother you if you let him alone. Better give him whichever berth he feels like. Them double-decker cars is just as good on top as they is below." McAllister followed the keeper down the narrow gangway that ran around the prison. In the stone corridor below, a great iron stove glowed red-hot, and its fumes rose and mingled with the tainted air that floated out from every cell. Above him rose tier on tier, illuminated only by the gray light which filtered through a grimy window at one end of the prison. The arrangement of cells, the bridges that joined the tiers, and the murky atmosphere heightened the resemblance to the 'tween decks of an enormous slaver, bearing them all away to some distant port of servitude. "Get up there, Jake. Here's a bunkie for you." McAllister bent his head and entered. He was standing beside a 2-story cot-bed in a compartment about 6 by 8 feet square. A faint light came from a narrow horizontal slit in the rear wall. A faucet with tin basin completed the contents of the room. On the top bunk lay a man's soiled coat and waistcoat, the feet of the owner being discernible below. The keeper locked the door and departed, while the occupant of the berth, rolling lazily over, peered up at the newcomer. And then he sprang from the cot. "Mr. McAllister!" he whispered hoarsely. It was Wilkins, the old Wilkins, in spite of a new light brown beard. For a few moments neither spoke. "Sorry to see you here, sir," said Wilkins at length, in his old respectful tones. "Won't you sit down, sir?" McAllister seated himself upon the bed automatically. "You here, Wilkins?" he managed to say. Wilkins laughed rather bitterly. "I've been in stir a good part of the time since I left you, sir. And 2 weeks ago I pleaded guilty to larceny and was sentenced to 1 year more. But I'm glad to see you looking so well, if you'll pardon me, sir." "I'm sorry for you, Wilkins," the master managed to reply. "I hope my severity in that matter of the pen did not bring you to this." Wilkins hesitated for a moment. "It ain't your fault, sir. I was born crooked, I fancy, sir. It's all right. You've got troubles of your own. Only, you'll excuse me, sir. I never suspected anything when I was in your service." McAllister did not grasp the meaning of this remark. He only felt relief that Wilkins apparently bore him no ill will. Very few of his friends would have followed up a theft of that sort. They expected their men to steal their pens. "Maybe I might help you. What's the charge, sir?" With his former valet as a sympathetic listener, McAllister poured out his whole story, omitting nothing, and, as he finished, leaned forward, searching eagerly the other's face. "Now, what shall I do? What shall I do, Wilkins?" The latter coughed deprecatingly. "You'll pardon me, but that'll never go, sir. You'll have to get something better than that, sir. The jury will never believe it." McAllister sprang to his feet, in so doing knocking his head against the iron support of the upper cot. "How dare you, Wilkins? What do you mean?" "There, there, sir," exclaimed the other. "Don't take on so. Of course, I didn't mean you wouldn't tell the truth, sir. But don't you see, sir, it isn't I as am going to listen to it. Shall I fetch you some water to wash your face, sir?" He turned on the faucet. The clubman, yielding to the force of ancient habit, allowed Wilkins to let it run for him, and having washed his face and combed his hair, felt somewhat refreshed. "Oh, that feels good," he remarked, rubbing his hands together. It was obvious that so long as he remained in prison he would be either Fatty Welsh or someone else equally depraved, and since he could not make anyone understand, it seemed his best plan to accept for the time, with equanimity, the personality that fate had thrust upon him. "Well, Wilkins, we're in a tight place, but we'll do what we can to assist each other. If I get out first, I'll help you, and vice versa. Now, what's the first thing to be done? You see, I've never been here before." "That's the talk, sir," answered Wilkins. "Now, first, who's your lawyer?" "Haven't any yet." "All depends on the lawyer," returned the valet judicially. Now, there's Carter and Herlihy and Kemp, all sharp fellows, but they're always after you for money, and then they're so clever that the jury is apt to distrust them. The best thing, I find, is to get the most respectable old solicitor you can, kind of genteel family variety, with the goodness just sticking out all over him. It creates a atmosphere of innocence, and that's what you need, one as white hair and can talk about this boy here and can lay his hand on your shoulder and weep. That's the go, sir. I understand, said McAllister. Under the guidance of his valet, our hero secured writing materials and indited a pitiful appeal to his family lawyer. A gong rang. The squad of prisoners who had been exercising went back to their cells, and the keeper came and unlocked the door. McAllister stepped out and fell into line. His tight clothes proved very uncomfortable as he strode round the tiers, and the absence of a collar, yes, that was really the most unpleasant feature. His neck was not much to boast of, therefore he always wore his shirts low and his collars high. Now, as he stumbled along, he was the object of considerable attention from his fellows. At the end of an hour, another gong sounded. In a moment the tiers were empty. 50 doors clanged to. Well, Wilkins? Bein' as this is Sunday, sir, we have a few hours' service. Church of England first, then City Mission. We're not allowed to talk, but if you don't mind the howlin', you can snatch a wink of sleep. Christmas dinner at 12. Old Burridge, the trustee, was a-tellin' me as how it's excellent, sir. McAllister looked at his watch in despair. It was only 10:15. He had not been to church for 15 years, but evidently he was in for it now. Following his former valet's example, he took off his shoes and stretched himself upon the cot. On and on, in never-varying tones, dragged the service. The preacher held the key to the situation. His congregation could not escape. He had a full house, and he was bent on making the most of it. The hands of McAllister's watch crept slowly round to 5 minutes before 11. When at last the preacher stopped, carefully folded his manuscript, and pronounced the benediction, a prolonged sigh of relief eddied through the tombs. Men were waking on all sides. Cots creaked. There was a general and contagious yawn. Again the gong rang, and with it the smell of food floated up along the tiers. McAllister realized that he was hungry, not mildly as he was at the club, but ravenous as he had never been before. Presently the longed-for food came, borne by a trustee in new white uniform. Wilkins, who had been making a meagre toilette at the faucet, took in the dinner through the door. 2 tin plates piled high with turkey and chicken, flanked by heaps of potato and carrots, and 1 whole apple pie. Ah, thought McAllister, I was not so far wrong about this part of it. The chicken was perhaps not of the variety known as spring, but neither master nor man noticed it as they feasted, sitting side by side upon the cot. Carrots, philosophized McAllister, looking regretfully at his empty tin plate. Now, I thought only horses ate carrots, and really they're not bad at all. I should like some more. Wilkins, can we get some more carrots? Wilkins shook his head mournfully. Message for 34, message for 34. A letter was thrust through the bars. McAllister tore it open with feverish haste and recognized the crabbed hand of old Mr. Potter. East 71st Street, F. Welch, Esquire, Sir. The remarkable letter just delivered to me, signed by a name which you request me not to use in my reply, has received careful consideration. I telephoned to Mr. McBlank's rooms, and was informed by his valet that gentleman had gone to the country to visit friends over Christmas. I have, therefore, directed the messenger to collect from yourself his fee for delivering this answer. Yours, etc., Ebenezer Potter. That fool Fraser, groaned McAllister. How the devil could he have thought I'd gone away? Then he remembered that he had directed the valet to pack his bags and send them to the station in anticipation of the Winthrops' invitation. He was at his wits' end. How do you get bail, Wilkins? You have to find someone as owns real estate in the city, sir, to go on your bond. How much is it? $5,000, replied McAllister. Holy Moses! Ejaculated the valet. He regarded his former master with renewed interest. But the dinner had wrought a change in that hitherto subdued individual. With a valet and running water, he was beginning to feel his oats a little. He checked off mentally the names of his acquaintances. There was not one left in town. He repressed a yawn and looked at his watch. 1 o'clock. Just then the gong rang again. What in thunder is this now? Afternoon service, sir. City mission from 1 to 2:30. Ye gods! Ejaculated McAllister. A band of young girls came and stood with their hymn books along the opposite tier, while a Presbyterian clergyman took the place on the bridge recently vacated by his Episcopal brother. Prayers alternated with hymns until the sermon, which lasted 65 minutes. McAllister, almost desperate, fretted and fumed until 2:30, when the choir and missionary finally departed. Only half-hour, sir, and we can get some more exercise, said Wilkins encouragingly. But McAllister did not want exercise. He swung to his feet, and peering disconsolately through the bars, was suddenly confronted by an anemic young woman holding an armful of flowers. Before he could efface himself, she smiled sweetly at him. My poor man, she began confidently, how sorry I am for you this beautiful Christmas Day. Please take some of these. They will brighten up your cell wonderfully, and they are so fragrant. She pushed a dozen carnations and asters through the bars. McAllister, utterly dumbfounded, took them. What is your name? Continued the maiden. Welch, blurted out our bewildered friend. There was a stifled snort from the banca behind. Goodbye, Welch. I know you are not really bad. Won't you shake hands with me? She thrust her hand through the bars, and McAllister gave it a perfunctory shake. Goodbye, she murmured, and passed on. Lord! Exploded Wilkins, rolling from side to side upon his cot. Oh, Lord! Oh, Lord! Oh! And he held his sides while McAllister stuck the carnations into the wash-basin. The gong again, and once more that endless tramp along the hot tiers. The prison grew darker. Gas-jets were lighted here and there, and the air became more and more oppressive. With 5 o'clock came supper, then the long, weary night. Next morning the valet seemed nervous and excited, eating little breakfast, and smiling from time to time vaguely to himself. Having fumbled in his pocket, he at last pulled out a dirty pawn ticket, which he held toward his master. Here, sir, he said with averted head. It's for the pen. I'm sorry I took it. McAllister's eyes were a little blurred as he mechanically received the cardboard. Shake hands, Wilkins, was all he said. A keeper came, walking along the tier, rattling the doors, and telling those who were wanted in court to get ready. Good-bye, said McAllister. I'm sorry you felt obliged to plead guilty. I might have helped you if I'd only known. Why didn't you stand your trial? I had my reasons, replied the valet. I wanted to see my case disposed of as quick as possible. You see, I've been living in Philadelphia, and had just come to New York when I was arrested. I ain't want them to find out who I was or where I come from, so I just gives the name of Davidson and takes my dose. Well, said McAllister, you're taking your own dose. I'm taking somebody else's. That hardly seems a fair deal, now does it, Wilkins? But, of course, you don't know but that I am Welch. Oh, yes, I do, sir, replied the valet. You won't never be punished for what he done. How do you know? Exclaimed McAllister, visions of a speedy release crowding into his mind. And if you knew, why didn't you say so before? Why, you might have got me out. How do you know? He repeated. Wilkins looked around cautiously. The keeper was at the other end of the tier. And then he came close to McAllister and whispered, Because I'm Fatty Welch myself. 6. Downstairs, across the sunlit prison yard, past the spot where the hangings had taken place in the old days, up an enclosed staircase, a half-turn, and the clubman was marched across the Bridge of Sighs. Most of the prisoners with him seemed in good spirits, But McAllister, who was oppressed with the foreboding of imminent peril, felt that he could no longer take any chances. His fatal resemblance to Fatty Welch, alias Wilkins, his former valet, the circumstances of his arrest, the scar on his neck, would seem to make conviction certain unless he followed one of two alternatives, either that of disclosing Welch's identity or his own. He dismissed the former instantly. Now that he knew something of the real sufferings of men, his own life seemed contemptible. What mattered the laughter of his friends, or sarcastic paragraphs in the society columns of the papers? What did the fellows at the club know of the game of life and death going on around them, of the misery and vice to which they contributed, of the hopelessness of those wretched souls who had been crushed down by fate into the gutters of life? Determined to declare himself, he entered the courtroom and tramped with the others to the rail. There, to his amazement, sat old Mr. Potter beside the judge. Tom and his partner stood at one side. "Welch, step up here." Mr. Potter nodded very slightly, and McAllister, taking the hint, stepped forward. "Is this your prisoner, officer?" "Sure, that's him, right enough," answered Tom. "Discharged," said the magistrate. Mr. Potter shook hands with his honor, who smiled good-humoredly and winked at McAllister. "Now, Welch, try and behave yourself. I'll let you off this time, but if it happens again, I won't answer for the consequences. Go home." Mr. Potter whispered something to the baffled officers, who grinned sheepishly, and then, seizing McAllister's arm, led our astonished friend out of the courtroom. As they whirled uptown in the closed automobile which had been waiting for them around the corner, Mr. Potter explained that after sending the letter he had felt far from satisfied, and had bethought himself of calling up Mrs. Winthrop on the telephone. Her polite surprise at the lawyer's inquiries had fully convinced him of his error, and after evading her questions with his usual caution, he had taken immediate steps for his client's release. Steps which, by reason of the lateness of the hour, he could not communicate to the unhappy McAllister. "What has become of the fugitive Welch," he ended, "remains a mystery. The police cannot imagine where he has hidden himself." "I wonder," said McAllister dreamily. It was just 7 o'clock when McAllister, arrayed as usual in immaculate evening dress, sauntered into the club. Most of the men were back from their Christmas outing. Half a dozen of them were engaged in ordering dinner. "Hello, Chubby!" shouted someone. "Come and have a drink. Have a pleasant Christmas? You were at the Winthrops', weren't you?" "No," answered McAllister. "Had to stay right in New York. Couldn't get away. Yes, I'll take a dry martini. Waiter, make that 2 martinis. I want you all to have dinner with me. How would terrapin and canvas back do? Fill it out to suit yourselves while I just take a look at the Post." He picked up a paper, glanced at the headlines, threw it down with a sigh of relief, and lighted a cigarette. At the same moment 2 policemen in civilian dress were leaving McAllister's apartments, each having received at the hands of the impassive Frazier a bundle containing a silver-mounted revolver and a large bottle full of an unknown brown fluid. McAllister's dinner was a great success. The boys all said afterward that they had never seen Chubby in such good form. Only one incident marred the serenity of the occasion, and that was a mere trifle. Charlie Bush had been staying over Christmas with an ex-chairman of the Prison Reform Association, and being in a communicative mood, insisted on talking about it. "Only fancy," he remarked, as he took a gulp of champagne, "he says the prisons of the city are in an abominable condition, that they're a disgrace to a civilized community." Tomlinson paused in lifting his glass. He remembered his host's opinion, expressed 2 nights before, and desired to show his appreciation of an excellent meal. "That's all rot," he interrupted a little thickly. "It's all politics. The Tombs is a lot better than most second-class hotels on the continent. Our prisons are all right, I tell you." His eye swept the circle militantly. "Look here, Tomlinson," remarked McAllister sternly, "don't be so sure. What do you know about it?" Part 8 Part 9. Christmas Dinners, including Christmas Cheer, in Common Sense Papers on Cookery, 1877, by Arthur Gay Payne. Once more the season has come round in which our Saviour's birth is celebrated, and though more than 18 centuries have passed away, still the clarion voice rings as fresh as ever in our ears, "Good-will toward men." From the highest to the lowest, the sacred charm still works its magic spell. What child was ever sent to bed before its time, no matter what the crime, on Christmas Day? Oh, if we could only embed in our hearts throughout the year one half the charity that for very shame seems forced on us on this great festival, how far happier should we be! It is not, however, now my province to dwell upon the sacred character of the day, yet the whole subject is so deep, so unfathomable, that, like a still phosphorescent sea, the slightest touch is instantly surrounded by a halo of glory, faintly and dimly revealing to finite minds the infinite brightness that is hidden in its breast, and I cannot bear to enter into the practical details of the day's festivities without some slight allusion in honor of the author and founder of the feast. Now, the higher duties of the season being, of course, left out of the question, Christmas Day without its dinner would be like the play of Hamlet with the part of Hamlet omitted. A genuine Christmas dinner, too, reveals our real national taste, and proves to ourselves and all the world that we have not yet acquired a French one. I wonder if it is possible for a statistician to calculate how many huge sirloins of beef and immense turkeys are consumed on Christmas Day. Such substantial fare, so unkickshaw-like. Nor must we forget the goose of humbler life. Were it possible to calculate the exact amount of gratification given by mere eating, it would probably be found that the aristocratic sirloin and turkey fail to compare with the goose and sage and onion. We may add, especially the sage and onion. We will suppose the happy morning to have arrived, and the children gathered round the table, with cheeks so flushed with pleasure and anticipation that they rival in color the bright red berries that glisten in the holly on the walls, bright eyes to match the bright cheeks, eyes that have sparkled brighter as the well-known and looked-for chink has occurred, as the annual Christmas box has been slipped into the hand by the gray-haired father or uncle, as the case may be, whose own eye is tinged with water as his mind goes back to the time, too, when he himself was a boy, without a care or thought of the morrow, and who, conscious of the joy he's giving, walks away with a lighter pocket, but far lighter heart. Happy, happy times! Is there one who at such a moment has an anxious care? Yes, suppose the beef should be raw, the mince pie burnt, and the pudding all tumbled to pieces the moment it is turned out. Were it known, I dare say tears have been shed upon such trifles, but then trifles make up life. Perhaps the deepest anxiety is about the pudding. I will give the following recipe, which I have always found an excellent one. The ingredients required are 1 pound and a half of muscatel raisins, half a pound of currants, quarter of a pound of sultana raisins, half a pound of mixed candied peel, 3/4 of a pound of breadcrumbs, 3/4 of a pound of suet chopped fine, 9 eggs, quarter of an ounce of pounded bitter almonds, a tablespoonful of flour, a tablespoonful of moist sugar, and a quarter of a pint of brandy. The first thing to do is to stone the raisins. Cut the raisins into 2 pieces, and in taking out the pips or stones, be careful not to take out the pulp. For this reason it is undesirable to leave the stoning of the raisins to young persons. It is more than human nature can bear, and the strongest-minded child is apt to suck his or her fingers during the process, which, in addition to being far from nice, is apt to detract from the rich muscatel flavor of the pudding. The currants should be bought some days before they are wanted, in order that they may be first washed and then dried. Spread them out on a large sheet of coarse paper before the kitchen fire, and occasionally stir them about. They will also require picking, and this wants both care and patience. Those tiny little stalks of the currants are very disagreeable to get into the mouth, and still more into a hollow tooth, for which they seem to have a natural affinity. The candied peel should be sliced into little, very thin slices, and not chopped up. The bread crumbs should be made as fine as possible, and the suet chopped up very fine. Care should be taken to get the very best beef suet that will chop properly, as some suet has a tendency to get into a creamy mass. When this is the case, it is impossible to make a proper pudding of it. The dry ingredients should now be placed in a large basin and thoroughly mixed together, care being taken to put in the pounded bitter almonds little by little. The eggs should be broken one by one into a cup, in order to see that each one is perfectly fresh. One stale egg will quite spoil a pudding. Beat up the eggs all together till they froth, and mix them in with the rest, and add the brandy. If the breadcrumbs were properly dried, it would not be found to be too moist. Next, take a new pudding cloth that has been well boiled in plain water, and butter it thoroughly, and then flour it. Turn the pudding into it, and tie it, leaving room for the pudding to swell. The cloth must be fastened very securely, and it is as well to tie it in 2 places in case of accidents. This pudding must now be boiled for at least 6 hours. It will always be found best to make the pudding some days before it is required. Hang it up in the cloth, putting something underneath it to catch the drops, and a pudding made as we have directed will keep good for months and months. It only requires warming up for a couple of hours in a large saucepan of boiling water, and then turning out. Now, that awfully critical moment, turning out. Care should be taken to peel off the cloth, and not pull it. The reason of this is self-evident. On Christmas Day, a piece of bright holly, with some red berries on it, should be stuck on the top of the pudding, and some lighted brandy poured over it and round it. If you take my advice, you will light the brandy in the room. To carry a large flat dish with ignited brandy is extremely dangerous, and I have not forgotten that dreadful story which appeared in the papers 1 or 2 years ago, about the poor girl who was burnt to death by the lighted brandy from the Christmas pudding falling on her white muslin dress. In order to light the brandy, get a large iron spoon and fill it with brandy. Get a lighted cedar taper or thin wood shaving, or even a piece of paper rolled up, and act exactly as if you were going to boil the brandy in the spoon. In a few minutes the brandy will light of its own accord, when it can be poured on the pudding, and more added if required. If it is evening and young children are present, it is as well to turn down the gas very low, or remove the candle for a few minutes. Judging by my own recollections, the lighted plum pudding was a great event in my early days, slightly awful, but intensely delightful. With regard to the beef, I need say but a few words. It is a question between you and the butcher, and I will say, butchers as a rule behave very well at Christmas time, and while I think of it, I should recommend you to give your carving knife to the butcher boy, and tell him to get it well sharpened for the occasion, a hint that will not be forgotten. The day after Christmas will have its due effect. But sirloin of beef has a trying piece of gristle at the top, and without a sharp knife a very handsome piece will be made to look ragged. Have a good roaring fire. A piece about 12 pounds will take 3 hours. It will not require much basting, but remind the cook that it is the sides and not the fat part that should be basted. Some stupid women forget this. Let the dish for the beef be thoroughly hot, and this takes time. Have just some curly white horseradish to pile on the top of the joint, and be sure the dish cover is hot without being smoking. We will next discuss the mincemeat, and would recommend a trial of the following recipe. Take 3 apples, 3 lemons, 1 pound of raisins, 3/4 of a pound of currants, 1 pound of suet, 1/4 of a pound of raw beef, 2 pounds of moist sugar, 4 ounces of mixed candied peel, 1/4 of a rind of a fresh orange, 1 teaspoonful of powdered mixed spice composed of equal proportions of cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg, half a pint of brandy, and 1 glass of port wine. Peel the apples and cut out the cores very carefully, and then bake the pieces till they are quite soft. Squeeze the lemons and cut away the white pappy part, and boil the lemon peel till it is fairly soft. The raisins must of course be carefully stoned, and the currants well washed and dried and picked, as in the case of the pudding. Chop the suet very finely, as well as the raw meat and lemon peel. Mix all the ingredients well together, and add the brandy last of all, and press the whole down into a stone jar, and place a piece of paper soaked in brandy on the top. Remove the paper and stir up the mixture thoroughly every 3 days, replacing the paper. If this is done, the mincemeat will keep good a long time. To make the pies, roll out some thin puff paste, butter a small round tin, and line it with a piece of paste. Then place in a generous quantity of the mincemeat, and cover it over with a similar piece of puff paste, and bake it in a moderate oven. Mince pies are none the worse for being warmed up, but pray take care that they are sent to table hot. Let us next proceed to the goose. Now a fine, large, tender goose, with a sauce tureen of fine, rich gravy, and another of hot apple sauce, with a nice, large, floury potato, is not to be despised, and to my mind is worth half a dozen turkeys. I am afraid the sage and onion, the necessary accompaniment, causes it to be considered rather a vulgar dish. Never mind, let us be vulgar. It's only once a year. The principal thing is the stuffing. Onions vary so in size that it is a little difficult to describe, but for a large goose you must take 5 large onions and 10 fresh sage leaves. If you are obliged to put up with dried leaves, you will want nearly twice the number. Take rather more than 1/4 of a pound of bread crumbs, about a couple of ounces of butter, and add some black pepper and salt. Chop the onions very fine with the sage leaves, and mix all up together, and the yolks of a couple of eggs may be added if you wish to have the seasoning very rich, but they are by no means necessary. This will make the stuffing that 9 persons out of 10 really prefer, but do not like to say so. If, therefore, you really wish to have the stuffing mild, the only difference must be, you must cut out the cores of the onions, and partially boil them, and let them drain on a napkin. This takes away considerably the strong onion flavor, of which some persons are not very fond. Fill the goose with the stuffing, and roast it before a quick fire. Care must be taken that the goose is well tied up to prevent the stuffing coming out at one end, or its getting filled with grease during basting at the other. A good-sized goose only requires 1 hour and a half to roast, and the general fault is that people will over-roast them and dry them up. The largest goose I have ever seen would not take more than 2 hours, but try, in the case of a very large one, to have the stuffing off the chill before you put it in. Serve some rich brown gravy and apple sauce in a separate tureen, as you will be sure to splash the gravy in carving the goose, if any is put on the dish. With regard to roast turkey, I can only say that no possible time can be given for roasting, as they vary so, especially in the present day of plump prize birds, that even the weight would be no criterion. A small turkey will require 1 hour and a half, while a very large one may want 5 hours. One word of caution about the stuffing. Everyone knows how unpleasant a tendency what is called veal stuffing has to rise. this, I believe, owing to too much lemon peel being almost invariably used. When you use 1/4 pound of beef suet, 1/4 lemon is amply sufficient. To this quantity may be added a couple of teaspoonfuls of dried mixed stuffing herbs, which can be bought in bottles at Covent Garden Market, 2 ounces of lean ham, rather more than 1/4 pound of bread crumbs, 2 eggs, a little chopped parsley, about a teaspoonful, or rather more, and a little grated nutmeg, salt, and cayenne pepper. Mince all the ingredients very finely together, and pound them afterwards in a mortar. A very nice stuffing for turkeys can be made from chestnuts, but space will not allow me to enter into further details. In conclusion, let me add, let Christmas come as a blessing and not as a curse. The demon alcohol is abroad in this holy season, and many know that they require an archangel's strength to trample him under foot. Let the law of each feast be regulated like that of the wise Eastern monarch. None did compel. Let every one on Christmas Eve endeavor to find some case of distress which it is real and not false charity to alleviate. He will doubly enjoy his own dinner, who can think that some one but for him would have gone without. It is such deeds that entitle us to say, that his bones, when he has run his course and sleeps in blessings, may have a tomb of orphans' tears wept on them. Christmas cheer. There is something sacred in the very name of home to every true-born Englishman, and, as we should naturally expect from the hallowing influence of this holy season of the year, home seems doubly sacred on Christmas Day. How many thousand families throughout the land are united but once a year? What efforts, too, do some make so that, on their great annual holiday, they may once again find shelter under the old and loving parental wings? But let us this year anticipate the day's festivities, and Christmas Eve finds us once again reunited around the fire, on which the log is heaped and crackles brightly. For no one, unless by abject poverty compelled, would have a poor fire on Christmas Eve. The fresh-cut holly glistens on the wall, the curtains are drawn, and the gray-haired, bright-eyed old man, as he glances round the circle, his voice too full almost to speak, yet feels an inner comfort difficult to describe, a feeling partly of thankfulness, partly of resignation, as he looks forward to the fast-approaching time when the places that know him now shall know him no more forever. For it has been well said that children, though they increase the cares of life, yet mitigate the remembrance of death. But such a good old-fashioned circle round the fire on such a night would not be complete without a steaming bowl of something hot, to drink a toast in memory of yet another happy gathering in the old house at home. So, while the party assembled listened to the distant sound of the waits, or perhaps to the still preferable music of the bird of dawn, which recalls one of the brightest gems that have dropped from the pen of our greatest poet, we will, after repeating the lines, step downstairs and brew a bowl of bishop. Some say that ever that season comes wherein our Saviour's birth is celebrated, this bird of dawning singeth all night long, and then, they say, no spirit dares stir abroad. The nights are wholesome, then no planets strike, no fairy takes, nor witch hath power to charm, so hallowed and so gracious is the time. Bishop is a good old-fashioned drink, whose nose has, so to speak, been somewhat put out of joint by mulled claret, since that beverage has become so cheap, is best made as follows. First, take a small lemon, and at this season of the year they will be easily obtained, white and new. First, wash the lemon in a little warm water, and then stick into it a dozen or more cloves, and make the lemon hot by placing it in a plate in the oven, or better still, by suspending it from a string in front of the fire, taking care that the lemon does not hang too close, so as to get so hot as to split. Next, take a little water, about a tumblerful, and pour it into an enameled saucepan, and add to it a stick of cinnamon about 6 inches long, of course breaking up the cinnamon. Also put in the juice of a small lemon, 1 blade of mace, a quarter of a nutmeg grated, and 4 lumps of sugar that have been rubbed over the skin of a fresh, pale-looking lemon. Put a lid on the saucepan, and let these spices boil on the fire gently for half an hour, or a little more. Next, take a bottle of port wine, and decant it gently, in case of sediment, in the ordinary way. Heat this in a saucepan, but do not let it boil. As soon as it is hot, pour the wine into a bowl previously made thoroughly hot with hot water. Add the liquor of the spices and lemon juice through a strainer. Place the hot lemon in the bishop, and grate a little fresh nutmeg over the top, and add sufficient sugar to the whole, according to the taste of the party. Of course, this is a somewhat strong mixture, and is certainly not altogether suited for children in any quantity. However, by adding more boiling water and more sugar, it can soon be made weaker. Of course, the proper vessel into which the bishop should be poured is a punch bowl. Unfortunately, punch bowls are somewhat rare. If the party is tolerably large, a wash-hand basin makes a very fair substitute. Of course, you would pick a small one, and as ornamental as possible. Now, a thick basin requires a good deal of warming, so should you adopt my suggestion, recollect to fill the basin with boiling water some time before it is wanted. In lieu of a punch ladle, the soup ladle will be found a worthy substitute. I would also remind you of warming the glasses, not only for the sake of keeping the bishop hot, but to avoid breakages. In cold weather, especially when it is frosty, pouring any hot liquid into a cold glass is very apt to end in cracking it. The bowl, too, should be placed in front of the fire on a hassock in the center of the family circle. Mulled claret is made in a very similar manner to bishop, only no roasted lemon is required. Take a small quantity of water and boil in it for some time the same quantity of cinnamon and mace as recommended for the bishop, but do not put in any lemon juice. After this has boiled for some time, add some white sugar, a dozen lumps or more, for claret requires a far greater amount of sugar than port. After adding the sugar, do not boil up the water and spices, as the addition of the sugar makes it extremely likely to boil over. Next, warm a bottle of claret on the fire, taking care, as before, not to let it boil. When it is thoroughly hot, strain off the sweetened and spiced water, and add a little grated nutmeg and a tablespoonful of pale brandy. If you have a large jug with a strainer in the spout, there is no occasion to strain off the spices. Mulled claret is generally put into a jug, and not into a bowl. There is a good old-fashioned sound about the wassail bowl. I have never tried the following recipe, but will give it, as it sounds fairly correct. Heat in a saucepan a pint of Burton ale with half a pound of sugar, a grated nutmeg, and half an ounce of grated ginger. After it has just boiled up, add a quart more ale, 4 glasses of golden sherry, and a couple of ounces of lump sugar that has been rubbed over the outside of a lemon. Add also a few thin slices of lemon. Make the whole mixture hot without boiling it, and add half a dozen roasted apples that have had the cores stamped out and cut, but that have not been peeled. Of course, this must be placed in a bowl which must be treated, as we said, with hot water. The sort of ale that must be used for the wassail bowl is evidently strong old ale, like Burton or Edinburgh, and I should think the more sweet and oily the ale, the better the wassail. Mild ale or bitter ale would not answer, especially the latter. I have on previous occasions gone into the mysteries of mince pies and plum pudding, as well as into turkey stuffing and goose stuffing. How to roast a sirloin of beef, though important, is too well known to warrant many words. There is, however, no season in the year in which cold roast beef is so plentiful as the day after Christmas Day. Now, though cold roast beef really does not want any sauce at all, yet there is one that so admirably suits it that I think it is well worth mentioning at the present season. I refer to horseradish sauce. Horseradish sauce used to be made by mixing together grated horseradish with sugar, mustard, vinegar, and cream. There has, however, been an admirable modern invention called Swiss milk, preserved in tins. When, therefore, you have any compound requiring cream and sugar, by using Swiss milk with ordinary milk, you get an exactly similar result at a far less cost. To make horseradish sauce, proceed as follows. Take a stick or two of horseradish and send it through a coarse grater till you have sufficient pulp to fill, say, a couple of tablespoons. This grating process, like chopping onions, is far from pleasant, as it makes one cry. Next, dissolve about a teaspoonful of Swiss milk in a little ordinary milk, say 2 tablespoons of the latter, and mix in about a teaspoonful of made mustard and a teaspoonful of vinegar. Then mix in the 2 tablespoonfuls of horseradish pulp and stir it all together. The consistency should be that of good thick cream. Of course, by adding more pulp, the mixture will be rendered thicker. Should it be too sweet, of course, it is owing to there being too much Swiss milk, and as Swiss milk is apt to vary somewhat in sweetness, it is as well to act cautiously in using it, as it is always easy to add, but impossible to take away. Some persons, when serving horseradish with hot beef or hot rump steak, warm the sauce. This is a great mistake, as by warming the sauce you utterly spoil it, and, to my mind, render it absolutely disagreeable. In speaking of Christmas dinners last year, I mentioned that an exceedingly nice stuffing for turkeys can be made from chestnuts. As anything in connection with turkeys is very apropos of the present season, I will now describe how to make chestnut stuffing and chestnut sauce. For a large turkey, take about 60 chestnuts and slit the skins, and fry them for a short time in a little butter in a frying pan till their husks come off easily. Then boil the chestnuts in some good strong stock till quite tender. Take 1/2 and pound it in a mortar with a little pepper and salt and scraped fat bacon. Stuff a turkey with this and an equal quantity of ordinary veal stuffing or sausage meat. With regard to the sauce, take the remainder of the chestnuts and mix them with some good strong gravy, rubbing the whole through a wire sieve with a wooden spoon. A couple of lumps of sugar and a glass of sherry are an improvement. Of course, the best stuffing of all for turkeys is made from truffles, but then they are so expensive as a rule that the recipe would not be practical. End of Part 9. End of A Christmas Miscellany, 2020, by Various.